That's a nice touch. I've never seen a secretary do that. Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Committee is meeting today to hear from the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Kirsten Nielsen, on the administration's priorities for the department. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Our homeland faces threats on multiple fronts. International terrorists seek to attack our country and kill Americans. Human traffickers, drug smugglers, and gangs like MS-13 are crossing our borders and infecting our neighborhoods. Nation states and hackers are engaged in cyber warfare, and the next natural disaster can strike at any moment. We cannot let our guard down. We need a budget that matches these most pressing needs. Fortunately, the President's FY2019 budget request addresses many of these concerns. The $1.6 billion for a border wall and additional funds to hire more ICE officers and Border Patrol agents will help curb illegal immigration. Securing our borders continues to be one of my top priorities. That is why I introduced legislation to get the job done. My bill authorizes $18 billion for the construction of a border wall, ends funding for sanctuary cities, closes dangerous loopholes, and puts more boots on the ground. It also secures ports of entry, authorizes National Guard to provide aviation and intelligence support, and targets visa overstays, and also provides for strong technology, which is desperately needed down there. This administration has been a strong supporter of these solutions, and I commend the recent decision to deploy the National Guard to the border. I'm pleased to see that $713 million requested for cybersecurity operations at MPPD was requested. Cybersecurity is one of the most important missions of the department, as the Secretary knows. As Americans become more reliant on cyberspace, we are all targets. This committee has a strong bipartisan track record on this issue. We passed bills to expedite hiring at DHS and enhance cyber threat information sharing. We also recently secured $26 million to support election infrastructure. In January, the House approved our landmark bill to create a standalone organization to elevate the cybersecurity mission at DHS. I am hopeful that the Senate will get this bill to the President's desk very soon. Another area of concern for me is aviation security. I have been very disappointed, I have to be honest, at the slow pace of installing computed tomography scans in our airports. However, I was pleased to see that we secured $65 million in the omnibus for TSA to begin installing the technology, this technology immediately. These CT scanners provide 3D imagery to help stop IEDs and other threats from boarding airplanes. Compared to the technology we have now, it's a difference between an X-ray and an MRI. The FY2019 budget request also requests an additional $71.5 million for CT, which will certainly help, but I don't believe that's enough to mitigate the threat landscape that we have currently. Many terrorists are only one plane ride away from the United States, and our aviation sector is still the crown jewel of targets. DHS must fight through all bureaucratic hurdles so CT scanners are in our airports and last point of departure airports for inbound flights as soon as possible. Some parts of this budget request will help DHS carry out its mission, but others, I believe, miss the mark. The $473 million cut to FEMA grants for state and local first responders is a major step backwards. Many parts of the country, including my home state of Texas, were devastated by natural disasters last year. I personally toured the devastation after Hurricane Harvey, and our first responders played a key role in saving lives. Last week, our committee reviewed the lessons learned from both the Boston Marathon bombings and the recent bombings in my hometown of Austin. Our first responders were crucial in both cities, and they need our support. I hope today's hearing will shed light on why these grants are targeted for cuts. Protecting our homeland must be a unifying cause. Partisanship should end at the water's edge. Last July, the House passed the first ever comprehensive reauthorization of DHS with overwhelming bipartisan support. This reauthorization reasserts Congress's authority to write laws, streamlines redundant programs, protects taxpayer dollars, and supports America's frontline defenders and first responders. Unfortunately, our friends in the Senate have yet to pass our bill. I strongly urge them to do so without further delay. Now, Madam Secretary, in this Congress alone, our committee has passed 82 bills through the House and 6 were signed into law. Politico named us as the hardest working committee in Congress. A strong DHS is our goal, and we are here to support you. All of us are grateful for your service and for the hardworking professionals, the men and women at DHS. And we all look forward to working with you in keeping our homeland safe. Chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Madam Secretary. Today is your first appearance before the Committee on Homeland Security, 4.5 months after your swearing in as Secretary. I've served on the Committee of Homeland Security since its establishment, and I have been fortunate to work with all 5 of your predecessors from both political parties. Each of them, including your former boss, Secretary John Kelly, stopped by to establish a working relationship within days of being sworn in to the position. That did not happen with you, which is a shame. Just like you met some of the Republicans on this committee this morning, Democrats stand ready, likewise, to meet with you. Perhaps next time, another 15 minutes from your schedule, and you can stop by and meet some of the wonderful Democrats who love America too and want to do all they can to continue to keep America safe. While we fundamentally disagree with many of the Trump administration's policy, I can assure you that Democrats on this committee are just as committed as our Republican counterparts to keeping our nation secure while upholding our most important values. Chairman McCall has said, even in his opening statement of this committee, perhaps if others in Congress did as we do, we could, in fact, have a better situation. 82 pieces of legislation passed by this committee is no small feat. I would say to him, however, that it's not Democrats' fault that the legislation hadn't been signed. So we'll try to fix that too in time. I hope that in the future, Madam Secretary, you'll make more of an effort to conduct outreach to members of the Democratic side on the committee. We have former chiefs of police, county commissioners, members of the legislature, district attorneys, everyone you can name, and they all love this country. The American people expect no less that we engage each other in these important issues. Indeed, this is a critical time for the Department of Homeland Security. America faces threats from the troubling rise of domestic terrorism, mass shootings, and foreign terrorist organizations that seek to do us harm. Russia and other actors are likely to continue their interference in our election systems, including the upcoming midterm elections. Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands are still devastated by Hurricane Maria and Irma, and another hurricane season is just weeks away. Meanwhile, the department is dealing with problems of President Trump's own making: his Muslim travel ban, his decision to terminate the DACA program, his executive order on immigration enforcement and border security, which seeks to make us a nation of immigrants no more. No longer the department's chief of staff, but now its secretary, you're its leader. The buck stops with you, Madam Secretary. I'm concerned that since becoming secretary, you've not always been forthcoming on certain matters. You testified before the Senate that you do not specifically remember whether President Trump used a slur to describe African countries during a White House meeting. You claim I actually do not know that when asked at the Senate hearing whether Norway is a predominantly Caucasian country after the president questioned why we could not have more immigrants from Norway. And most recently, you declined to explain the president's tweet referring to a breeding concept in sanctuary cities in California. If this is indication of how you as secretary interact with the White House on Homeland Security policy matters, there may be cause for concern. Your recent statements on Homeland Security matters have been less than encouraging. Based on your press release this week, you would think the most important Homeland Security problem facing the nation is a handful of Central Americans moving through Mexico. That does not make it so. We know who they are, we know where they are, and we know they generally do not attempt to evade the Border Patrol, but rather present themselves to the agents and officers upon arrival. But fomenting fear about this so-called caravan gets airtime on certain media outlets and plays well with elements of President Trump's political base. Better to distract the American people from the real issues facing the department and perhaps from the president's own problems too. Likewise, we've heard a lot in recent days about so-called loopholes in our immigration system as it relates to children. These are not loopholes. They are basic humanitarian protections enacted by Congress to protect vulnerable children and ensure that those who have legitimate asylum claims are heard and those who do not are returned home safely. We need only look at some of the terrible cases that occurred within this legal framework which implemented to know why Congress acted. Politicizing and demonizing children should be beneath the department, and Congress must not go down that path. As you know, Madam Secretary, the mission of the Department of Homeland Security is to safeguard the American people, our homeland, and our values. I appreciate this and understand that it's no easy task and that we are living in challenging times in more ways than one. I hope that the department, under your leadership, and with over 240,000 employees strong, live up to that. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. On December 6, 2017, Kirsten Nielsen was sworn in as the 6th Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. This is also the Secretary's first appearance before our committee. We thank you for being here today. Your full statement will appear in the record. The Chair now recognizes the Secretary for an opening statement.
Try that again. Thank you. Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the committee, it's a privilege to appear before you today. I'm honored to present the President's 2019 budget request for the Department of Homeland Security and discuss how that budget will help keep America safe. Let me first take a moment to thank this committee for its support for the $48.2 billion provided to the department in the recently passed Consolidated Appropriations Act. The support of this committee is critical to advancing the many DHS missions, and I truly thank you for your continued support. I'd also like to thank you for your support for our reauthorization. As you know, it is critical that the men and women of the department have the tools, resources, and skill sets that they need to further the mission of this country. The President's 2019 budget builds on the FY18 budget and requests $47.5 billion in net discretionary funding for the Department of Homeland Security. It also includes an additional $6.7 billion for the Disaster Relief Fund for response and recovery to major disasters. Today, I'd like to outline several core missions empowered by this budget. First, securing and managing our borders and enforcing our immigration laws. 2, protecting our nation from terrorism and countering threats. 3, preserving and upholding the nation's prosperity and economic security. 4, securing cyberspace and critical infrastructure. And 5, strengthening homeland security preparedness and achieving resilience. Within all of these missions, we're aiming to put our employees first and empower our frontline defenders to do their job. This will help mature the department and, more importantly, help us better secure the homeland. For border immigration, first, we're focused on securing and managing our borders and enforcing our immigration laws. While we have made vast improvements in border security over the last 15 months, we continue to see unacceptable levels of illegal drugs, dangerous gang and transnational criminal organization activity, and illegal immigration flow across our southern border. The current statistics for last month tell a dangerous story. Overall, the number of illegal aliens encountered at the border increased more than 200% when compared to the same time last year. Perhaps more troubling, the number of unaccompanied alien children encountered has increased over 800%, and the number of families encountered increased over 680%. We also saw a 37% increase in drug seizures at the border in March, and I am sad to report we have an increase in 73% in assaults on our border agents. This is unacceptable, and it must be addressed. We must do more to secure our borders against threats and illegal entry and close dangerous loopholes that are making our country vulnerable. We have been apprehending gangs, TCOs, and aliens at the border with historic efficiency, but illicit smuggling groups understand that our ability to actually remove those who come here illegally does not keep pace. They have discovered and continue to exploit legal loopholes to avoid detention and removal and have shown no intention of stopping. These legal loopholes are strong pull factors that entice those looking to circumvent our laws. For border security to work, violation of the law must have consequences. As I've said many times, interdiction without the ability to promptly remove those who have no lawful basis to enter or remain is not border security. It undermines our national security, and we must work together to close these loopholes. This budget would invest in new border wall construction, technology, and infrastructure to stop this illegal activity. I would be remiss if I did not say that one of our greatest investments is in our people, recruiting, hiring, and training additional U.S. Border Patrol agents, additional U.S. Customs and Immigration Enforcement officers, and additional support personnel to carry out these vital missions. Secondly, we must continue to protect our nation from terrorism and decisively counter threats. This is the reason the department was created, and it remains a cornerstone of our work. Terrorists are adapting. They are taking an all-of-the-above approach to spreading violence. That includes promoting attacks on soft targets, using homemade weapons, and weapons they can bring in a bring-your-own-weapon style approach. It includes crowdsourcing their violence through online radicalization, inspiration, direction, and recruitment. But they also remain focused on conducting sophisticated attacks, including using concealed weapons, weapons of mass destruction, and modifying new technologies such as drones into deadly weapons. This budget ensures that our defenses keep up with the innovation of our enemies. For instance, it allows TSA to advanced tools to detect threats. It funds new CBP initiatives to identify high-risk travelers. It ramps up our defenses against WMD, and it provides vital funding to protect soft targets, from concert venues to schools, against attack. Third, we are focused on preserving and upholding the nation's prosperity and economic security. On an average day, the Coast Guard facilitates the movement of $8.7 billion worth of goods and commodities through the nation's maritime transportation system. Each day, at our nation's 328 air, land, and sea ports of entry, CBP welcomes nearly 1 million visitors, screens more than 67,000 cargo containers, arrests more than 1,100 individuals, and seizes nearly 6 tons of illicit drugs. Annually, CBP facilitates an average of more than $3 trillion in legitimate trade while enforcing U.S. trade laws and processing more than $2.4 trillion in international trade transactions every year. The President's budget helps provide critical resources to these efforts to keep our country competitive and to advance the prosperity of our people. The budget also will help us continue efforts to keep foreign adversaries from stealing our trade secrets, technology, and innovation. Fourth, we must secure cyberspace. This is one of my personal priorities, as there is much to do in this area. Our networks are under attack constantly from all corners of the physical world. That's why DHS is taking historic strides to address systemic cyber risk, secure .gov networks, and strengthen the security and resilience of critical infrastructure. The budget would enable DHS to support state and local election officials in defending the integrity of our election systems. As you know, the department's mission is to provide assistance to election officials in the form of advice, intelligence, technical support, and incident response planning, with the ultimate goal of building a more resilient and secure election enterprise. Through investing in hardware, software, intrusion detection, and analytical capabilities, we're better able to secure the digital ecosystem that makes our American way of life possible. Fifth and finally, it is a core mission of DHS to strengthen Homeland Security preparedness and achieve national resilience. Last year, according to NOAA, our country experienced one of the most costly and damaging seasons for natural disasters in its history, with a cumulative effect costing $300 billion. Through the FEMA and in cooperation with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments across the country, we will devote the resources and attention needed to ensure recovery. But we must also help communities across the nation create a culture of preparedness to be more resilient to disasters. A culture of preparedness is a national effort to be ready for the worst disasters at all levels. This budget helps us with these efforts and supports the DRF, which is necessary to help state and local governments respond and recover. In conclusion, we need to empower the men and women of the department to carry out these 5 missions and many others by giving them the resources they need. In addition to the various areas I mentioned today, I am also firmly committed to maturing the department and putting our employees first. It is an honor to serve alongside the men and women of DHS who work tirelessly each day to secure our country and who are often unrecognized. I thank them for this service. I thank this committee to support our budget in supporting our employees, supporting our missions, and helping to make our nation more secure. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I now recognize myself for questions. First, let me just say this committee passed a historic border security bill providing $38 billion in funding for the wall, technology, personnel. I've joined Chairman Goodlatte in his legislation to close legal loopholes. But I think before we get to that, I think you have to justify that need. It's important to look at the threats that we face from the southern border. Your predecessors, both General Kelly and Acting Secretary Duke, talked about transnational criminal organizations providing a potential means for transferring weapons of mass destruction to terrorists. There are reports today that this caravan is on its way to Tijuana. Can you tell us a little bit about the threats that we face as a nation and why border security is so important?
Yes, sir. So I think the way to think about it is any threat that we face as a nation, if it can get across our border, our adversaries will do all they can to bring it across the border. So what we look at is everything from drugs to the transnational criminal organizations you mentioned, to smugglers and traffickers who smuggle all kinds of illicit things, not just people, but weapons, potentially weapons of mass destruction, other illicit technology. They avoid our trade regulations, putting our economic prosperity at risk. And we see increasing violence on the border. I would also point out that we have seen ISIS in written materials encourage ISIS followers to cross our southwest border, given the loopholes that they also are aware of. So we have a multitude of threats. We have emerging threats, as you know. We're probably likely to talk about UAS at some point today, but UAS is yet another form of threat that we're beginning to see more and more at the southwest border.
Yeah, and I recall being briefed on ISIS sort of bragging about the ease with which it would take to bring a weapon of mass destruction into the United States. I have to take that seriously, as they appear to be warning us of their intentions. When we talk about closing legal loopholes, you know, the first bill I ever filed in Congress 14 years ago was to end the catch and release program. And here we are 14 years later, still dealing with this problem. I'm very frustrated, as I know you are. Can you tell me why this is so important?
I can. So the way that I think about this is in terms of home security. If you have an alarm in your home and you catch a burglar and you call the police and the police come, and in fact it is an illegal entry into your home, but the police then tell you that they have absolutely no ability to detain or remove those criminals, and the criminals stay in your house, you would not tell me that is home security. That is what we face at the border. We stop people, we interdict them, but we do not have the authorities, given the loopholes in many cases, to detain and remove them. We are forced to release them back into the communities after they have committed crimes. We have eliminated the administrative use of catch and release, which was popular in the last administration. We do all we can to enforce the rules that you have passed, but given some of the court cases and some of the legal loopholes, we are unable to do that in all cases.
And I think to most Americans, they just don't understand that, how that could possibly, you can detain, but you can't deport them, and then they get released into our society in the United States. This so-called described caravan, as I understand it, may be already in Tijuana. In your opinion, if they cross into the United States, which is their full intention, what will you be able to do?
Well, I think we have made quite clear, first of all, the Attorney General has made quite clear, we have a zero tolerance for illegal entry, but we have advised in every way we possible that we are aware of to let those participating in the so-called caravan know that participating in a caravan does not give you any additional legal rights. If you illegally enter our country, you will be referred for prosecution. If you file a false asylum claim, you will be referred for prosecution. If you aid and abet or coach someone to break our laws, you also will be referred for prosecution. So we're very clear about this. We will enforce our laws. It's an unfortunate situation that there's a belief that by coming in groups, it affords you some sort of legal protection that is not otherwise afforded under our law.
My concern is with the legal loopholes, which is really Congress's role to act. Under Article 1, we have the authority under the Constitution to pass immigration laws. If we fail to act on these legal loopholes, my concern is they will be released. You'll have the same problem with this caravan. Once they come to the United States, they will be detained and then released into our society, and that is Congress to blame, Madam Secretary, not you. And that's why it's imperative, I think, Congress act on this bill that we have before us. My final question has to do with aviation security. As you've received the threat briefings, I can say everyone on this committee has received the threat to our aviation sector, the briefing involving computer laptops and poisonous gases. I think I speak for everybody on the committee. We are very alarmed by this, and we want to do everything in our power to make sure the American people are protected on flights, both domestic and international. We appropriated in the omnibus $65 million to move this forward. We will complete that full appropriation in September for 300 CT machines so that your men and women can properly screen at airports to protect Americans from explosive devices that may not be seen today. My question is, how quickly can these machines be deployed? And then finally, I think the highest risk are the last point of departure airports, coming in from Istanbul and Cairo and Riyadh and places I've been to where the airport security is not as good as ours. And what is your plan to make sure this technology is also at those last point of departure airports?
As you said in your opening statement, sir, unfortunately, the terrorists continue to see this as a crown jewel, if you will, of attack vectors. We also remain very concerned about aviation security, and in particular, how quickly the adversary is advancing tactics and techniques and weaponry to bring down an airplane. So the CT machines, we thank you for your support. They are critical very critical in our ability to detect these emerging threats. As you know, we're testing the machines as well as the algorithms that go with them that enable us to detect these new threats this summer. We look forward to the appropriation in 2019 so that we can, in fact, cover down over the United States in terms of protecting Americans here. Last points of departure are another type of threat area that obviously a plane comes from a last point of departure to the United States. What we have done there is, you know, last year we substantially raised the bar in aviation security across the world. We have a tiered plan. We continue to work with countries to encourage them to adopt the CT technology. In exchange for that, we pull back on other requirements that we have levied on them. So we have tremendous outreach occurring. I met with my G7 security ministers Monday, Tuesday. We talked about this again. We talk about this almost in every way we can. But you're exactly right to highlight the threat, and we will continue to focus on it.
Well, thank you. I think it's one of the biggest threats that we face from the terrorists today. It is a spectacular event that they'd like to talk about, not a 1 to 2 man operation or a vehicle assault. It would be a major event that we want to do everything we can to work with you to make sure it never happens. So thank you for being here. I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, one of the oversight responsibilities we have with DHS is to kind of see whether or not things are going according to the wishes of Congress and this committee. To that extent, there are a number of policy deliverables that are outstanding from the department at this point, and I'm going to go through the list and try to get some idea on when we will receive them. The quadrennial Homeland Security Review was due December 31, 2017. Do you have any idea when we might get that document?
Yes, sir. I believe we've coordinated with this committee as well as our your sister committee on the Senate side to work through the best way to present that information. We want to make sure that it is part of a larger national security strategy, counterterrorism strategy. As you know, we have other strategies that are due at the department. So the idea is to get the timing right so that they actually work in parallel and we don't have one that then is inconsistent with another due to timing restrictions. So happy to come brief you further on the progress and how that nests into many of the larger requirements that we have.
Madam Secretary, it's the law.
No, I understand, sir. So we have worked with you on the timing, but I'm happy to come brief you, as I said, specifically about that.
So you don't plan to follow the law on delivering the report? I mean, that's all I'm asking. It's due to say you coordinated. That's all right, but it's the law that you have to produce the report.
And respectfully, sir, I did not say that I would not follow the law. What I did say is that we're working on it. We have told you what the timing is, and I'm happy to come brief you further if you would like.
Well, I'm not necessarily looking for a briefing.
Okay.
I need from you, very simple, when you plan to follow the law.
We will get back to you.
Beg pardon?
We will get back to you.
Will you get back to us in writing?
If you would prefer that instead of a briefing,
I would
to do that.
absolutely prefer it in writing. We have also a department-wide cybersecurity strategy that was due March 23rd, 2017.
Yes. So we were out at the RSA conference last week. We spent quite a bit of time talking to stakeholders to finalize that as a last very important effort to make sure that we had stakeholders involved. We'll have 4 pillars of that strategy. We're looking to identify the risks, to reduce threats, reduce vulnerabilities, and mitigate consequences. We also have it based on 5 trends.
I appreciate that, but when can we as members of this committee receive the written report?
Shortly.
That's outstanding.
Shortly. The strategy, is that's what you mean, yes, sir.
A week? 2 weeks, a month?
It should be within the next 2 weeks, yes, sir.
Within the next 2 weeks,
Yes.
thank you. Now, the long-awaited update plan for the department's major headquarters consolidation project, it was actually due August 27, 2016. When do you anticipate getting that to us?
That one I'll have to get back to you, sir. I'm not as familiar. I know we continue to be in discussions. As you know, we've had some funding issues as well as some construction delays given the historic nature of the property. So I will get back to you on time for that.
Thank you. And those 3 reports, if you would provide in writing the status updates and when we can expect them, I would appreciate it. With respect to Hurricane Maria, are you satisfied with FEMA's response to Hurricane Maria as it relates to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands?
FEMA will, well, as you know, it's not over yet. FEMA will continue to provide recovery services under its statutory mission until they're complete. We continue to work very closely with the governor and the local the government officials, mayors in the case of Puerto Rico. We can always do more. It was a very difficult situation, as you know, given, especially in Puerto Rico, the status of the infrastructure before the storm. FEMA pre-positioned more than it ever had before. We had many people there in conjunction with our interagency partners, and we're going through the formal lessons learned process now, but recovery is ongoing. So we should have the findings from the initial response shortly.
So your testimony, you're not satisfied with it, or you are?
It was a big storm, sir. I think FEMA went above and beyond in performing its statutory mission, but we always learn lessons and we always make it better for the next time.
What systems have you put in place so that whatever shortcomings occurred with Hurricane Maria won't occur again?
One of them is the administrator is deploying federal integration teams. The concept here is to send steady state people out into the field who are experts in incident management, preparedness, prevention, mitigation, to help different areas and jurisdictions be able to prepare for an event. So what we're trying to do at this point is push resources to left of the event. As you know, recent studies have shown for every $1 of mitigation, we save $6 in, a dollar in prevention and mitigation. We have $6 saved in terms of response and recovery. So what we were doing is re-looking at all of our systems so that we can build those cultures of resilience and preparedness.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, on January 16th, you testified before the Senate that 90% of unoccupied alien children released never show up for court. Can you provide this committee with how you came up with that 90% figure?
Sure. When we encounter UAC, we register them. As you know, we, at the department, turn them over to the Department of Health and Human Services. So we have the numbers, and then
and what I'm saying is in writing.
Oh, okay, sure.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair will recognize members who were present at the start of the hearing by seniority on the committee according to the rules. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for your testimony here today, and thank you for your service. I have basically 2 questions. I'll ask them together so you have more time to answer them. First is on the issue of grants, Homeland Security grants. I live right outside New York City. New York City, Nassau, and Suffolk, Westchester County are the #1 terrorist target in the country by all accounts. There's well over 1,000 police officers work full-time on counterterrorism and intelligence. We have subways carrying over 5 million people a day, 1,000 entrances and exits. We have commuter lines, Long Island Railroad and Metro North, about hundreds of thousands more. And yet, in the budget, UASI grants are being cut, SHISCAP grants are being cut. And to me, there may be some other alternative plans, but the fact is, these police departments and these fire departments and these emergency service units in these locales. And I'm not disparaging any other part of the country. They can fight, and they need it too. But again, we have been attacked many times, twice just in the last 6 months. There's been over 20 attempted attacks against New York, besides the 2 attacks on the World Trade Center. So I would just, again, ask you to reconsider and look at how that money is being distributed and why we have cuts at a time like this, when, again, in many ways, the threats are more than they were before 9/11. They may be not of the same magnitude as 9/11, but as far as numbers and the metastasizing of Islamic terrorists, there's more threats today than there were then. That's my first question, is on that. An easy one. Second one is on MS-13. MS-13 is, to a large extent, focused in my district. We've had over 25 murders in the last 2 years. They're right now digging for bodies within a mile of my house. This goes on continuously. But let me commend both HSI and ICE for the work they're doing. They're working very closely with the local police, with the local district attorneys, with the FBI. So progress has been made. But one of the deficiencies we have, and this is not really your department's responsibility, but I think you have a say in this. This is on the question of the unaccompanied minors. It was brought to my attention last year, both by federal intelligence and also local police, that many of these minors who come across, when I say many, maybe 5 or 10%, whatever the number would be, are actually sent here by MS-13 in El Salvador. When they come to the border, they're apprehended by Border Patrol, but then turned over to HHS. And then HHS places those kids with families around the country. A disproportionate amount are going to Brentwood and Central Islip in my district. Intelligence, as I understand it, is showing that the families who are asking for these kids are either, in many cases, or too many cases, either supporters of MS-13 or their relatives back in El Salvador being threatened by MS-13. In the most recent murders, of the 11 people indicted for the murders, 6 of them were unaccompanied minors that came across the border within the last 2 or 3 years. When I talk to the school superintendents, they talk about how the unaccompanied minors, a number of them, are recruiting within the schools. And yet, HHS, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, does very little as far as notifying the local police when these children, unaccompanied minors, being placed in the community. I would ask if you get the administration to work with HHS and your own department to better coordinate this so the local police are told who these kids are, where they're coming from, and also a better job of vetting the families that they're being placed with, and also a better job of vetting the families they came from. So those are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. As you said, grants are not an easy conversation. The way we're looking at this, and we'd love to work with you further, we've put out, as you know, about $50 billion in grants since 9/11. And the idea there was to help state and locals build capacity to threats that they hadn't necessarily had to address before. It was very important at that time to make sure that the state and locals had what they needed to protect their communities. As the threat environment quickly changes, what we're trying to do is find ways to have grants not just maintain and help state and locals continue the capacities they've built, but enable them to focus on the new and emerging threats. So what this budget proposes is a new $525 million program, preparedness program, to focus on emerging threats. So it's not, I understand the question, but I just want to make the point. What we're trying to do is use the grants holistically in a way that we can cover down on the threats that we know we have, but also the threats that are emerging. So
I would just say that the threats, I realize there's new threats, but again, a large amount of this money are spent on surveillance, on programs which are ongoing. The threat is ongoing, and it's not as if they always need new equipment. Sometimes they do, but it's also they have to have the training and the, again, constant work that goes on. When you have 1,500 working on it, and they are working full-time, you know, whether or not the threats change, those 1,000 to 1,500 still have to work.
Yes, so we need to balance the maintenance and sustainment with the idea of the grants to begin with, which is to build capacity, to build new threats. But I did want to just take a few minutes to answer your other question. MS-13 does continue to be a problem, as you know better than most in this room, given the violence that has occurred in your area. Through Operation Matador and others, as you say, HSI does play a very active role. We continue to work very closely with our colleagues at the Department of Justice to attack this from a network perspective, which means going all the way back to where they're originating, watching their travel patterns, attempting to stop them at the border, of course, but should they enter, make sure that we understand where they are and where they're headed. Happy to work with HHS to make sure that that referral process works better and more effectively. I would also say that one of the loopholes that I often talked about is the fact that we cannot, based on gang affiliation alone, prohibit somebody from entering the United States. It is not a legal criteria in and of itself for inadmissibility. So we also need to look at inadmissibility and removability when it comes to gangs so that we can make sure we can remove them. The final point I would say on the UACs, we are working with HHS to better vet the sponsors and the family members so that we can understand where the children, for the children's safety, are going and who will take care of them, but also so that we can identify other issues that might occur. As you say, we see recruiting from the gangs in New York all the way down to Central America, and we see the push from Central America to send UACs who are gang members into the United States.
And again, let me emphasize that Homeland, HSI, ICE are doing an excellent job working with the FBI and local police in
Thank you, sir.
Nassau and Suffolk. Thanks.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much, and thank you for this hearing along with the ranking member. Let me welcome you, and I don't often make this comment, but I think the ranking member made a point that I quickly want to say, and that is that I had the tragic privilege of being on this committee shortly after the beginnings of this committee, shortly after 9/11, and was able to go to ground zero during the long extended period of the recovery of remains. And so there is nothing more precious than the security of this nation, and I think it's bipartisan. I do want to acknowledge Takala and Madison. I brought them here today. They are Take Your Daughters to Congress, and they're in the room today, and I wanted to acknowledge them. I'm going to put a series of questions on the record, and then I'm going to ask which ones that I'd like you to do in writing or I'll indicate. I want you to tell me how many African Americans do you have in your immediate circle of staff? I don't see any in the room that seem to be with you today. So I'd be interested in that and your efforts on that. As it relates to the wall, I'd be interested in knowing whether Mexico is going to pay for the wall, and so how the wall is going to proceed, as well as the 4,000 National Guard you mentioned, and certainly I want to respond to the assaults on Border Patrol agents. I think we should respond to that in whatever recommendations that you may have. But the 4,000 National Guard, as I understand it, coming from Texas, being on the border, they will be unarmed, and I see no way that they'll have an impact on the protection of border security, Border Patrol guards that are there now. And so what is the purpose of the 4,000, and did you have input into that selection? We know that there's a recent court decision that indicates that the DACA structure right now and the President's removal of DACA status is illegal. And frankly, there has been no placement. We have a number of bipartisan bills to be put on the floor. Would you and the President ask and demand that Paul Ryan put these bills on the floor for us to be able to vote for them? And then secondarily, would you instruct your Border Patrol agents to not treat DACA eligible and or DACA status individuals unfairly at the border by stopping them at the border, not allowing them to come back and forth? The other question is that I've been working extensively on a young man from El Salvador who lived in this country more than half of his life, 2 American children, citizen wife, manager of a paint store, and I have repeatedly asked the Homeland Security Department to address the question of Jose Escobar, who was, I would say, duped into doing what he always does, is reporting to the ICE office and precipitously being deported to a place that he has no knowledge of. And we have not gotten one answer regarding the ability for him to have humanitarian parole to come back to this country and to address his status because he's DACA eligible. TSA is in definitive need of retention programs and salary programs, because in your major airports, and I don't know if you've been to all the major airports, there is a constant rotation or departure of TSOs, and that needs to be fixed. FEMA needs to be fixed in terms of bifurcating recovery as opposed to rescue. And in Houston, reimbursement, and I want to thank FEMA and their staff. They're dedicated persons, but reimbursement monies have not yet come to schools and other facilities and people in desperate need. Two other points. Domestic terrorism, the Mark Anthony Conduit did kill other people in Austin, but he also killed 2 African Americans initially, and I think it was appropriate for many of us to think of his inclination and call it domestic terrorism. We heard nothing from the Department of Homeland Security. Finally, the President has gone to Mar-a-Lago 1 day out of every week that he's been President, and 110 times he's played golf. And I want to know your response to the Secret Service's long hours. So let me ask you to answer the African-American question, all the others I want in writing, the TSA retention question, and the domestic terrorism, and you can just do quick sentencing, and Secret Service in terms of payment and the responsibility of taking Secret Service to these joyful places and the long hours that they have to do. TSA retention. Are you working on that?
Yes, ma'am. That is throughout the department, as you know, we do have some attrition problems that remain. It is a priority of mine as part of maturing the department to become much more innovative. So we're looking at mobility programs.
I'm going to let you go quickly. Domestic terrorism.
Domestic terrorism. We've created an Office of Terrorism Prevention Partnerships, as you know, to take very seriously all forms of terrorism in this country and work on
Did you speak
prevention.
about the incident in Austin, Texas, in terms of potential of being domestic terrorism?
I can speak to it only to say we're working with state and local
If you had anything in writing on that, I'd appreciate it. I just want to go for it. Mr. Escobar, would you look up Mr. Escobar? I've joined a bill with Mr. Green asking for him to be able to return. But more importantly, this can be handled by administratively by the, Homeland Security. Will you look at the point of Mr. Escobar from Houston, Texas?
We will look at the case, yes.
Secret Service and the many trips of the President to places beyond Camp David, which is an appropriately beautiful place, and the extra hours and the tiredness of Secret Service and the need for extra staff. How are you handling that burden?
We're working on hiring initiatives. We're working on cross-training. We thank Congress for recently passing the bill that allows the Secret Service to be paid overtime. That will help very much with attrition and morale. We also, in that case, are looking to cross-train and give them more ability to move within the Secret Service to reduce some of the burden that they have.
African Americans in your staff?
I don't have the exact number in front of me. We do have diversity programs. We take that very seriously. Happy to get you specifics.
Do you have any on your immediate staff?
And my immediate staff is rather large, but I don't know.
In your office?
In the personal front office, we do not.
All right. All the other questions, I'd appreciate it if you would more extensively answer in writing. I do want to just conclude by emphasizing the treatment of DACA status individuals. What is the department's position, since most courts have indicated that DACA is a legitimate status, to indicate to your employees that they should not be treated precipitously and disrespectfully and detained, which is what is happening?
We are complying with all court orders. So what that means is if you are a currently registered DACA recipient, you will not be deported. If you have applied for recertification as a DACA individual, you also will not be
And you'll
deported.
take new applications?
We are not taking new applications right now, no, ma'am.
All right. If you could give me answers to all the rest, including why you're not taking new
It's not required at the moment. So, as you know, we ended the program because it was an inappropriate use of
I
executive
understand.
power.
If you could just put that in writing, since the courts have indicated your ending of the program was incorrect, why you're not taking new applications. In
Okay,
any
so
event,
just to be clear, though, the courts have not said that. What the courts have said as of recently in the last couple days is they've asked the department within 90 days to come and provide them additional information. Should they find that that information is not sufficient, they reserve the right to take additional action. No court has ordered me to allow new DACA recipients.
I disagree with you, but I would prefer if you would submit that to me in writing along with the other questions that I did not specifically get. I thank the chairman and the ranking member. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Madam Secretary, thank you for being here, and thank you for your service to our country. On a parochial note, before I get to my questions, I want to personally invite you to, now that you're settled in, to come and visit the Center for Domestic Preparedness in Alabama. As you know, it has done a stellar job since 9/11 in training first responders all around the country, hospital personnel, and it has the only live agent training facility for biological and chemical agents. So I think you'd find it interesting. The last secretary to be there was Janet Napolitano, and I'm sure you'll be as impressed as she was. But in your written statement, written testimony, you stated that, quote, investments in our layered defense at the border would include 65 miles of new border wall construction in the highest traffic zones along the southwest border. Yesterday, we had the CBP commissioner testify before the Transportation Security Subcommittee, and he talked about, in addition to the border, the wall itself, the importance of technologies associated with it to give us situational awareness at those borders. Can you describe for us what you see as your idea of a border wall system, and meaning not just the wall itself, but what would that system be comprised of?
Sure. So border wall system is the infrastructure, which is important for the impedance and denial capability. It's in the technology, which among other things helps us with the domain awareness, situational awareness. That's the sensors technology. It's also at the ports of entry, the non-intrusive technology that helps us detect drugs and illegal entrants. It's personnel, mission readiness, so making sure we have a workforce who's trained. And the last is access and mobility. So it's very important that the Border Patrol is able to get to parts of the wall where parts of the border where there is a wall or there isn't a wall to be able to interdict. So it's a combination of all of those things.
Have you been able to ascertain what percentage of the cost associated with the border security system is actually the wall, and what is the rest of that system that you just described, which is substantial? The technologies and personnel are substantial.
Yes. In fact, we had asked for $1 billion alone for some of the technology when we were talking about the $25 billion total number for the wall system. I can get back to you on that. It changes, frankly, as we work with Congress and we're appropriated money. And then, as you know, in the last omnibus bill, we had some specific restrictions on how we could build the wall and where we could build it. So we're reprioritizing and reorganizing some of those funds that were given to us by Congress. So happy to get you specific figures.
Yeah, I'd like to get a proportion, because, you know, one of the things that we've heard is a lot of the critics of securing the southwest border talk about the numbers being unreasonably high per mile for this wall. And in fact, we're not just talking about the wall or the fencing itself. We have to help people understand that there's a lot more that goes to it than just putting that fencing up, or whether it's see-through or concrete or whatever at different points. Let me ask this. Do you feel like you have enough money right now to take on that challenge and secure the southwest border in its entirety?
Not in its entirety, no, sir. So our goal is operational control of the border. That would have those 4 master capabilities I mentioned. We do not yet have funding to secure the whole border.
Well, one of the things that my friend and colleague from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, requested information about a little while ago was whether or not Mexico or South America is going to help pay for the wall. One of the things I would draw to your attention, if you're not aware of it, is a bill I introduced called the Border Wall Funding Act, which would assess a 2% fee on all remittances going to South America. Half of that, and it would generate right at $1 billion a year. Half of that coming from Mexico, the other half from the other South American countries, where most of these illegal aliens who are coming to our country are leaving, which would in fact require Mexico to pay for at least half of the wall. Now, granted, it's $1 billion a year; it wouldn't do it all, but I hope that y'all will look at embracing that as one of several funding mechanisms to get us the money we need to secure that wall. You also, in your testimony, said, quote, some critical missions are impeded by jurisdictions that refuse to cooperate with DHS on enforcement of federal law. I think you're talking about sanctuary cities there.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us briefly what kind of added expense do you encounter when you have to go into an area that's a sanctuary city or a county and they refuse to cooperate?
I'll get you the figures, but it's additional use of technology. It's certainly an additional use of manpower. It's additional planning, additional contingencies that are built in. But in essence, what it requires us to do is, rather than being able to take the criminal in a safe environment, which would be the jail, we then require our agents to go out into the community, putting themselves at risk, but putting the community at risk, to be able to interdict yet again, unfortunately, that criminal, to be able to remove them.
Well, if we can get our heads around that added cost, I want this committee to consider legislation that would force those sanctuary cities to reimburse the department for those added expenses that they're imposing on you. With that, my time's expired. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. You said in your opening remarks that you're trying to create a culture of preparedness. And in response to Congressman King's questioning, you said you want to build up a greater capability for emerging threats. You know, we'll never know where the emerging threats may come from with surety, but we're pretty sure we know where the response to those threats are coming from. And those responses are coming from our front line. In fact, in my years here on the committee, I often ask, you know, what's the most important aspect to our homeland security? And the answer almost always is our frontline responders. That being said, this budget does not reflect that commitment to preparedness at all in terms of those responders. There's cuts to the state homeland security grants that states like Massachusetts, my state, use of $157 million, the urban area security initiatives, which were so critical in the Boston bombing marathon and the response in cities like New York, cut $180 million. The transit security grants, which is a target of great concern given what's happened in other parts of the world, cut $64 million. The emergency performance grants, $70 million. The funds to our local fire departments, frontline responders, have been cut. So if you could, tell us how cutting this kind of funding helps America be safer.
Yes, sir. So grants are part of a holistic approach to help state and locals prepare, as you know. So as I mentioned earlier, it was actually the National Institute of Building Sciences that released the report. But $1 on the front end saves us $6 on the back end. So that's what we mean by culture of preparedness. It's capacity building. And we do a lot of that through programs that aren't a direct distribution of funds. We help with exercises. We help with training. We do have money in the budget for equipment through our CWMD office to provide detection and training for those particular threats. We have money in the budget for NPPD to help state and local officials as well as critical infrastructure owners and operators in cybersecurity. We continue to invest in FLETC to provide additional...
No, I understand that, Madam Secretary, but you know, why are you cutting where we know with certainty the response is coming from?
So
those are wonderful things.
Yeah.
But
those do that.
But these are the first responders that are going to be there.
That's what all those programs do. They help local communities and first responders be ready to respond.
But these are tried and tested.
Exercises
and have saved
and
lives.
training.
The
Yes,
things
sir,
I mentioned have all saved lives. And so with a culture of preparedness with emerging threats, how is that greater? How are we safer with that? Those are critical monies to police, fire, that they cannot do on their own. It includes regional kind of preparedness. So I'll leave it with that, but I'm concerned, and I think I'm not alone on this committee on both sides of the aisle in terms of that concern, because we have seen the effectiveness. If I could shift very quickly, one other area. President Trump, in his private life, even though he's president, he continues in his private life and his private business life to take advantage of H-2B visas for his personal businesses. They're there for him. They're not there for everyone right now because there's a demand. I represent a seasonal area where small businesses really rely on this. And under the Bush administration, they merely raised the cap. Under the Obama administration, they raised the cap several times in the past, responding to this demand. But you've had the opportunity to deal with it, and the small businesses in my district are telling me that the way that rolled out last year, the regulations, the uncertainty, the burdens on a small business was so great that they didn't even dare, and they were being advised by their own attorneys even, not to enter into it. Now, could you tell us the time frame for acting on these additional H-2B visas? The clock's ticking and businesses are losing money. American jobs are being hurt by this because by not hiring a full complement of workers, they're closing down for weeks that they would normally be open, days that they would be open. So it's hurting American jobs as well. And why, if we're going to roll this out, why couldn't we just do what President Bush did, what President Obama did, and just raise the cap on returning workers? Those are the safest workers. You don't see returning workers overstaying their visas. We have a problem with that in other visas. But these are people that have a history of working, by the way, paying into Social Security and other benefits that they're never going to realize, going home, and then coming back. They're safe. This is tried and tested. This is common sense. Why can't the department simply have the cap raised on returning workers and deal with this in a timely fashion and not leave so many revenues that would be important for our economy wasted and lost? It doesn't affect the president, but it's affecting people in my district. Could you?
Yes, sir. So as you know, we did raise the cap last year. I worked into
Yes, but excuse me, but
yeah.
I told you what my businesses are telling me loud and clear. Many of them wouldn't even take advantage of it because supposedly a pro-business friendly administration made it so uncertain and they wouldn't even dare try. They just shut down for weeks. So
Sure.
I know you did it last year. I'm asking you
No,
not to do it the same way this year.
Yeah. So the reg is done. The reg actually was a result of talking to many members who have a concern in their district, and the concern was that the visas were being given to those who are not seasonal workers. We unfortunately have seen an increase in fraud, so what the reg was meant to do
Again,
was to
excuse me, but that's an enforcement issue. So the answer to better enforcement,
it's not an
the answer to
enforcement
better enforcement is not to scuttle the program, not to make it ineffective. It's to
Right.
do better in enforcement. And you know,
Yeah,
clock is
I would ask Congress to act. I mean, I personally worked into the wee hours of night to try to get this addressed in the omnibus. It's Congress's job to legislate immigration. I have asked repeatedly for you to put the cap in law and for you to put in law that returning workers
again,
can come
if
back.
I could amplify that,
Sure.
89 members, bipartisan members, that signed a letter asking the leadership to do that. Now, they didn't. They gave you the authority again, as they did before. But within that authority, you still have the ability to do it. So,
Yes, so the visas
I'm
should
asking
be-
you to
the
do it
visas
and
should
act
be-
in a timely way and in a way that businesses can take advantage of this.
I agree. There is no reason to have a visa program that puts American businesses out of business. That's not the intention.
Well,
We are
thank you.
working. We should
If you
have
could
it-
get
we
back
should
to
have
me
it out
on
much-
that, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Secretary. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, you have a tough job, and we appreciate your service. I got 4 questions. I'm going to try and ask them all. There's a little narrative with each one for context, and then I'm going to let you answer and try and be respectful of everybody's time. Some cases in the past, including Iraqi refugees living in Bowling Green, were arrested in 2011, and a Saudi immigrant living in Oklahoma arrested in February of this year, demonstrate how individuals have been able to make it through DHS vetting despite being associated with terror groups. In both of these cases, derogatory information was then later discovered in DoD databases showing that the men in both cases were linked to al-Qaeda. Ensuring the battlefield data is available for DHS vetting is essential for Homeland Security, and the question is essentially, will the proposed National Vetting Center created by this administration in February of this year prioritize addressing this vetting vulnerability, and how you feel about that, if you think that's going to be adequate. Question number 2, what is DHS doing to collect DNA from non-U.S. persons being detained under the United States laws, understanding that there's a requirement that they're collecting the collection of the DNA from detainees to send a CODIS for law enforcement purposes. Question number 3, many Americans hope we end the catch and release program, but it seems the current ICE parole policy is almost the definition of catch and release, and that parole policy is not codified in law. That was enacted under the last administration and can be unenacted, so to speak, under the current administration. people with valid claims of asylum should receive it, but those who claim it unlawfully should not be paroled into our country, where we rely on those individuals who were unlawful and dishonest to willingly reappear or appear at a hearing. And then question number 4, I have the privilege of chairing the Oversight, Management, and Efficiency Subcommittee. As the name might suggest, one of the roles is to look into what sort of financial waste could be eliminated in DHS. This Congress we have held hearings on the consolidation of St. Elizabeth's campus, integration and updating of financial systems for some of the components at DHS, which is currently, I might add, undergoing its 4th iteration and failure, and some of the cumbersome character fitness examination processes that contractors undergo before they can work on some project. Here's the problem, ma'am. None of these things are particularly headline-grabbing topics. They're not real sexy, and while I know that the country has, and you have much bigger fish to fry, they remain systemic problems year after year. And I'm just wondering, you know, let's just pick, like, if we look at the individual disparate parts, they all seem to be doing their job and doing it fairly well. But the integration component, where leadership is required to bring them together, never seems to somehow come through. So I'm wondering, the question is this: does the agency have benchmarks in that regard for Congress to evaluate not only integration but some of these other problems and the successes? And I'll stand ready to re-ask any of those questions if you haven't gotten them.
Thank you. And the National Vetting Center, the short answer is yes. That is exactly what it's created to do. It's to use both high-side information and information from our allies to help us continuously screen those who seek benefits. As you say, unfortunately, sometimes between the initial screening and the granting of a status or a benefit, additional information comes to light that would necessitate us changing the original determination. So,
we know it's hard to be perfect, but
yes,
we
that
want to
is,
strive for
and,
that, right?
You know, we continue to expand so-called HSPD 6 agreements, which is an agreement with a foreign country to provide known and suspected terrorist lists. We have over 60 now. And we continue to work with all of our allies to implement the UN Security Council 2396, which, as you know, would include that transmission of you know, passenger name record information. The second one, the DNA. So yes, it is required in law, but as you also know, a waiver was signed between then Attorney General Holder and then Secretary Napolitano, exempting most of DHS from that.
But don't we want to side on law enforcement and collect that DNA while we have those people? I mean, I know there's a waiver, but shouldn't we?
Yes, so we are working with the Attorney General currently to form a pilot to start doing that, to start collecting the DNA. So that
do you have an expected start date?
We're working on the pilot right now, so I can get back to you.
Oh, the pilot's occurring right now?
Yes, sir. We're in the planning stages, and we're doing it in batches. So as you know, some of it is the processing. We want to make sure we have the chain of custody. But
okay,
yes, happy to get right back to you.
I want to keep the conversation open on that.
Got it.
All right.
The third one, ICE parole. So we have eliminated what we call administrative catch and release, which I believe is what you're talking about.
So you come and you claim a credible fear, right?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so if
Yeah.
you claim a credible fear, you do then go into the asylum process. If it's deemed that you have a credible fear, you then go through an immigration judge and go through.
Right. But in the past, there wasn't the parole situation, right? So you claimed a credible fear. We detained you to determine, really, do you have a credible fear? And if you didn't, then it was essentially fraudulent, and then we had the opportunity to send you back to wherever you came from because that was erroneous, right? But now people know that they can claim a credible fear. We'll parole you, right? You're released out into our country, and then we never see you again, and we don't know whether you had a credible fear. And it seems like the current parole policy is actually a magnet. People know that, and they know they can just come and claim it, and they'll be paroled, and they'll never have to answer for that parole. And that's what I think most of my constituents that are interested in ending catch and release are concerned about.
Understood. Part of that is detention bed capacity. So if you're not a flight risk, there are a limited number of people who are provided essentially monitoring ankle bracelets so that we can track them in different systems when we detain them and we don't have.
Do you need more money for ankle bracelets? Is that?
We need more money for detention beds. The numbers
Why can't we?
keep
Can we
going
use
up
the ankle bracelets if you're going to detain? If you're going to parole these people, is that a viable? Is that viable? Is that not viable? Do they take them off, or what's the story there?
They can evade them. Yes, sir. So it does help us. It's not a silver bullet. But in terms of numbers, and if we need more, happy to get back to you on specific numbers on that. The last one was St. E's, but more broadly, integration. Unity of effort should not be it's not a destination. It's a constant endeavor. We have developed some benchmarks internally, everything from measurements to performance controls, internal controls, to work on joint task force to eliminate inefficiencies. Happy to give you more details on
can we get that information?
Happy to.
Thank you, ma'am. I yield, sir.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. I apologize initially. I wasn't sure I recognized, but when they brought up the Norway, you not knowing Norway was a Caucasian company, then I remembered I knew who you were.
That's a funny one. I'm very proud of my heritage, but I am an American. All Scandinavian countries are not the same. And I wasn't going to, the way the question was asked, testify under oath to something that I can't guarantee was right.
I understand.
So I'm not really sure why that became a story. I don't know why it would be a requirement of the Secretary of Homeland Security to know the racial makeup of every country. I do not do screening based on race, religion, or creed. But thank you for raising that again, sir.
As we have had to do in other committees, reclaiming my time, I would think that it was just, I was just saying how I remember who you were then, and then if I related with that. Let me ask you also, since we're on topics, the wall is something that seems very important to many people in this country. Would you agree?
Yes, sir.
And who's going to pay for it?
The President continues to ask Congress to appropriate, and so we thank you for the funds this year. As you know, we have $1.6 billion requested in 2019.
But during the campaign, who was going to pay for it?
I can't speak to the campaign, sir, but right now we have given you our budget request.
I'll tell you, I didn't even watch that much. Mexico was going to pay for the wall. How much have we gotten from Mexico for the wall?
We have, as I said, continued to work with you all to request money in the budget to build the wall system.
Not Mexico.
We have requested the money from Congress through the appropriations process.
Okay. Well, I heard a lot about Mexico paying for it. I just wanted to be clear. You know, there are a lot of issues in TSA with low morale. You can see why. What are you doing in terms of looking at this issue in your organization? You know, when it comes to employee satisfaction with their job, their pay, organization, and their willingness to recommend their organization as a good place to work.
I think morale is a multifaceted issue, one that we must take very, it's very critical. We must look at it very importantly. I think helping to understand the mission and your part in the mission is part one of morale. Making sure that you have the training, that you understand what is available to you for retirement, understanding the mobility that you might have within an organization. These are all things that are important. Communications from leadership I find to be very important. I don't expect employees to learn about things in the news. I hope to always keep them in the loop and help them to understand what it is that we do on a day-to-day basis.
There seems to be a question of consistency in training. New TSA officers, TSOs, as opposed to old TSOs, not getting the same training and therefore creating gaps in the system which they're working in. Also issues around, you know, not enough TSOs that they can even take bathroom breaks where I've even had a report of a TSO having an accident on herself because they weren't allowed to leave their post. Now that's going, a bit too far, where people can't do humanly bodily functions because they're not allowed to leave their posts. That is something I think that really needs to be looked into and addressed. We have to make this situation where people want to come to work. They're on the front lines. They're doing difficult work with people that are not necessarily always patient with the processes we have to go through in order to make sure that they're safe. So there's a lot of stress on these officers. And so we need to do what we can to identify ways of making this circumstance a little more palatable for them throughout the course of their shift. And I see my time is up, and I'll yield back.
Sir, if you could provide me the name of that employee, I'm happy to personally look into that. That's not an acceptable situation.
Yes, I was shocked by that myself. So I'll try to get that information.
Thank you. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony today, and it's good to have you before the committee. I do, however, want to echo the sentiments of my colleague earlier today, the ranking minority member, because it is a problem that preceded you at the agency, and that is basically ignoring deadlines, both statutory and congressional deadlines. I was a federal prosecutor for 20 years, and I wouldn't dare ignore a deadline set by a court. And I see the same obligation with respect to your agency. We had a similar problem with respect to TSA, and we've had some very frank discussions on my subcommittee oversight of TSA, and I dare say that they've improved dramatically with respect to honoring deadlines. And the culture that preceded you, nevertheless, is under your watch now. And I would implore you to follow the deadlines and not, I don't think they're optional, and I don't think responses such as we'll get back to you are acceptable. And I think that that's a bipartisan feeling, and especially when it's a statutory deadline, that's law. And I would ask that you treat that less cavalierly and understand that those are deadlines that should be answered. Now,
Sir, if I could, I apologize if I misspoke earlier. All I was trying to suggest is I can't give you today a specific date, so I would get back to you on giving you a specific date. I completely understand what you're saying, and you have my commitment to work not only with TSA, but throughout the department to meet all statutory deadlines.
That's all we're asking. Thank you very much. Now, while switching gears, with respect to the border, and I spent a lot of time down there as a federal prosecutor in El Paso, going after cartel-level members, and I saw the border for the civ that it is. But I also spent a significant amount of my time as a prosecutor in the northern border, and I think it routinely doesn't get the attention that it deserves. About 95 to 96% of the northern border is unsecure. And I was just wondering how much time you spent analyzing the issue and whether you've had whether you've taken a look at the northern border threat assessment that was recently done.
Yes, and as you know, what comes after that is the Northern Border Security Strategy, which we hope to release shortly. We do spend a lot of time talking about the southwest border, but we do have issues on the northern border. I was just in Canada Monday, Tuesday, talking to my counterparts there about ways in which we can coordinate better of some of the unique aspects on that northern border. But yes, we need to keep that in mind always.
Thank you very much. And switching gears again, during my oversight at TSA, we've had much discussion with the chairman here as well as others about replacing, having the updated technology. We all know the bad guys are getting more advanced with their technologies, especially with respect to aviation, and it's quite concerning. And we also believe, and I think you'll agree, that the CT scanners are a new generation of helping to ameliorate that threat. And not only does it help ameliorate the threat, it's really would expedite throughput at airports, which is always a concern, especially coming with the high travel season coming. There is about 2,500 X-ray machines nationwide, and if you replace all those with CTs, what we're doing this year and next year is really kind of a drop in the bucket. We've asked TSA, and I don't know if they've spoken with you yet, about examining whether we should reprogram some of that money from other areas of Homeland Security to plow that into getting more of these X-ray or these CT scanners up and running. And I say that because we saw them firsthand, myself and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle here on a delegation to Europe. They're already on the front lines there. They're already being used there. And I understand the need to test these things, but there must be an expedited way to test them when they're already being used overseas. And by the way, they are American companies, and they're ready to provide these to you. And number one, the delay, but number two, more importantly, the reprogramming of that money. If you can look into where you can about reprogramming from other areas of Homeland Security. I think it would be a really prudent thing to do.
Just to answer quickly, so as you know, we did that in 2017. The current plan is if TSA is working as quickly as they can with industry to deploy them, and if in fact they're able to deploy the ones that we have appropriated, we will look to reprogram as we have done before.
Thank you very much. And lastly, with respect to TSA, there seems to be an ongoing practice here, and we've tried hard, both in this committee and in my subcommittee, to try and stop TSA from having people go through pre-check lines when they're not pre-check registered. Pre-check is a known and trusted traveler type program, and it's there for a reason because you minimize the risk because of their involvement in pre-check. The practice started as managed inclusion, then they had body detection officers, and they were throwing people into that lane that they shouldn't have been. Now that we told them they can't do managed inclusion, they can't do some of the things they're doing, they're just basically calling it by a different name. And we've made it clear to TSA that we're going to introduce some legislation to make it mandatory that you not do that. But I just wondered if have you had any discussions with the administrator at TSA about this pre-check problem?
Not this specific problem, no, sir, but pre-check, as you say, should be reserved to those who qualify for pre-check. So I will work with the administrator.
I'm very glad to hear that, and I thank you very much for your time. Now yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, is this budget your budget? Did you have any input in this budget?
We did, yes, ma'am. So the men and women of DHS put together their request, and it goes all the way up, if you will.
So this happened under your watch, too?
The 19 budget, well, in part. As you know, I joined in December, so we were
already
already well into the budget.
our greatest value statement is where we're putting our resources, and I'm just not 100% sure that there is a consistency between where your people or your budget applies its resources and its ability to keep this homeland safe. With regard to land transportation issues, there is a reduction in the security grants. There's a reduction in the Viper teams. There's a reduction or elimination of the law enforcement officers' grants. There's a reduction in the exit lane staffing. There's TSO staffing still is somewhere around 2,500 people short. I don't know how that helps us to be more secure in those areas where we're supposed to be. I don't understand where we are addressing the fact that our subways and our land transportation areas are soft targets and are being targeted. And so I'm going to ask that you respond to how this budget, in writing to me, because I've got a lot of questions, how these particular issues that I raised are a reflection of more security for our homeland. I want to know the difference, or I want to know if there is a difference between refugees and illegal immigrants as far as you're concerned. I want to know, is there a written statement as to what our U.S. policy is on people who are fleeing very dangerous countries or very oppressive countries or famine or whatever, versus other types of people who are coming over? Because I get the sense that we're locking them together. And I'm particularly interested in this caravan that is reaching our borders. I got the impression that we think of them as illegal immigrants who are going to come to our border, and then we're going to detain them. These are women and children. Yet we know who's in that caravan. If we really wanted to know if there's any danger in that caravan, you have the capacity right now to be vetting some of those people. So I want to understand what your policy is going to be when it comes to that caravan actually coming to our borders, willingly acknowledging that they're here and why they're here and what they're looking for. So I'd like you to answer that in writing. I want to understand this policy that we have where since, I guess it's December or October of 2017, we've taken more than 700 children away from their families. 100 of those children were under the age of 4, and they've been taken from their parents in immigration detention. I want to know how that makes our country safer and more secure, and I want to know what our policy is with regard to dealing with the trauma that must inflict upon both these children, these babies and these children, and as well as their families. I have a question with regard to the Secret Service. I sent a letter asking you all to explain to us the costs associated with protecting the Trump kids going around the world doing Trump business. I need to have an answer to that question. I want to associate myself with Mr. Katko because I was up there on the northern border, and a lot of concerns were expressed with regard to trafficking as well as drugs, opioids in particular. And it just seems to me that we think that we have this responsibility to the southern border and not to any of the other areas. And I guess the last thing I need to understand from you in writing is explain how we're justifying putting additional resources down the southern border, particularly in the form of our National Guard, when all of the data that we have been receiving, even data coming from your office, is that there's been quite a significant diminishment of people coming across the border. So what is the justification for putting more people and ramping up the southern border as opposed to shoring up some of our other targets, our soft targets? I mean, is there really a rationale, or is this just a campaign promise that's being fulfilled that has absolutely no anchoring in logic or consideration of where our tax dollars are going? I see that I'm 23 minutes over my time, so Madam Secretary, I'd just appreciate it if I could get the answers to all of my questions in writing. And then, Mr. Chairman, I just would like to acknowledge that I too have two foster daughters here today, Amina and Lauren, who are observing democracy in action. Thank you very much.
And welcome.
Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Welcome to the committee, to your stepdaughters. It's very nice. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Nielsen, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Earlier this week, Yuma Sector Border Patrol apprehended 61 people who entered the U.S. illegally. During an initial interview, one of these individuals claimed to be an unaccompanied minor. He later admitted he was an adult and a part of the MS-13 gang. UACs from El Salvador and other Central American countries are given different treatment than those from Mexico or other contiguous countries, or Canada, and are allowed to remain in the United States only to disappear into the shadows. We also have some other data points, as you know, that in a joint DHS-DOJ MS-13 operation last year, of the 267 gang members arrested, approximately 25% entered the U.S. as unaccompanied minors. And in June of 2017, a spot check of one of the HHS facilities that had 138 teens being held, 39 of them, roughly 30%, had ties to MS-13 and other gangs. Is it, in your view, MS-13 is actually using the loopholes in our law in order to send individuals to the United States? There's about 10,000 members of MS-13 estimated in the United States, and their motto is to kill, rape, and control. And I just want to hear your perspective on what's going on with MS-13 and how they're using these loopholes in order to further endanger communities around our country.
We see them starting in their countries of origin. They recruit young children. They train them. They train them how to be smuggled across our border, how to then join up with gang members in the United States. We similarly see gang presence within the United States reaching back down into countries within Central America and recruiting and also providing instruction. We see smugglers increasingly smuggle specific to MS-13, and we see all of the resulting effects of that from violence in general across the border, but also the drugs and other illicit things that go with that smuggling.
So thank you. So I mean, these loopholes we're talking about are very real, right? Because you're saying the MS-13 gang members that are here are recruiting minors, and they know that they'll be able to be let into the United States.
Yes.
And others, probably that are adults, they either, like in this case, try and pretend they're minors, or they tell them to say the right words, right? I have a credible fear.
That's right.
But then what's happening is they're then being released with a future court date that they never show up for, right?
That's right. We estimate we only have 3.5% of UACs that are eventually removed because they do not show up.
So, you know, closing these loopholes is paramount for security, for our national security, for our public safety. And the bill that Chairman McCall and I have, that we've been working diligently with you on, that I know you support, closes these loopholes. And I just really want to urge our colleagues that we have to bring some form of our bill to the floor. This is just one of the many issues that we're addressing in that bill to close these loopholes. This is not partisan. This is a public safety, local community, an important security issue that we're trying to address, and specifically highlighting this gang issue. So we also saw in California, according to DHS, 100 gang members, many of which belong to MS-13, were recently released from October 2016 to June 27 because of their sanctuary policies in California. So you have these gang members and other violent felons, violent criminals, that because of the dangerous policies of California, these individuals are being released back into our communities to be further danger to our communities instead of being handed over to federal authorities in prison, where it's safer for the community and safer for your agents. Can you just speak to specifically the dangers of that and what needs to be done?
Yes. So sanctuary cities began as a sanctuary for victims, as you know. What they have become over time, unfortunately, is a very contorted version of that, which is a sanctuary for criminals. And we need to be very clear about that. Sanctuary city protects criminals. It is not protecting the community. So as I mentioned earlier, what it requires us to do is send our agents not moving from a controlled environment back into the communities, putting that community at risk and other immigrants in that community that are not serious felons, and putting my officers and agents at risk. It's not, it doesn't make any sense. It's a way in which we're pitting blue against blue, federal law enforcement against state law enforcement, where we should all be working together to protect our communities.
Great, thank you for clarifying that again, because sometimes this gets misunderstood by people as to what the real impact is. And again, cracking down on these sanctuary cities is also in Chairman McCall's and our bill, and we look forward to working to move that forward. I fully support the National Guard being deployed to support border security at the southern border. I represent a southern border district. Can you just touch on how it's going so far? And we'd love to have you back to Arizona. I'd love to host you there in order to be able to talk to the ranchers, local residents, and see how things are going down at the border.
Well, thank you for the invite. I try to get to the border whenever I can. It's very important to learn from the people there who are on the front lines of what works and doesn't work. The National Guard, we have about 1,000 deployed. We have around 600 actually active at the, within the border communities. What they're doing is they're supporting CBP so that we have more badges on the border, so CBP can go and do their law enforcement mission. So they're helping us with surveillance, intelligence, fleet maintenance, road clearing, all of the enabling functions that help CBP to do what CBP needs to do.
Great, thank you. I'm over my time. I'll be back. Thanks.
Thank you.
Jolane's time has expired. I did meet with the Orange County Sheriff. It was of interest to me with sanctuary cities, and while they're barred by their state law, they do put the ICE detainees on a website that is then used publicly so ICE can make the safe transfer of the prisoner to ICE custody without releasing that criminal alien into the streets. I think that's very innovative. With that, Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Madam
Good morning.
Secretary. I have 3 questions I'll lay out for you, and hopefully I'm going to do it quickly so you can answer. My first question is, what is your personal opinion in your capacity as Secretary of Homeland Security on whether Russia interfered in our elections in 2016 and the likelihood that they will continue their attack on our democracy in 2018 and beyond? That's number 1. Number 2 is, earlier this month, USCIS released internal documents pertaining to the decision to end temporary protected status for Haiti. The agency's report stated that many of the conditions in Haiti that prompted the 2010 original TPS designation remained, and that country was still vulnerable. So despite this report, Director Lee Cisna wrote to then Acting Secretary Elaine Duke that Haiti had made enough progress and no longer met the conditions of the TPS designation. So my 2 questions are, why did Director Cisna, if you know, make that recommendation, which was clearly in conflict with his own agency's internal findings, number 1? And number 2, are there any similar internal reports from USCIS on the TPS designation for El Salvador? And if so, if you could provide those documents to this committee. And my last question, when you testified before the House Appropriations Homeland Security Subcommittee earlier this month, you committed to ensuring that, and this is a quote from you, any pregnant woman in our care in detention receives adequate care based on the recent change to ICE's policy on detaining pregnant women. So 3 questions. Which detention facilities currently offer prenatal care? Can you define for me what DHS's definition of, quote, adequate care is, and how you, as the Secretary, intend to ensure each pregnant woman receives it, and how will you hold detention centers and individuals accountable? And finally, what steps specifically are you taking to ensure that ICE is meeting the assurances that you made?
Thank you. So on Russia, yes, I don't think there's any question. Russia did attempt to interfere in our election system through a variety of means. As you know, they released everything from emails to through foreign influence techniques, used our social media to try to manipulate public opinion, and they did, in fact, attempt to undermine our elections by attacking our election infrastructure. I have no doubt they will continue to try to do this. It is a priority of mine. The portion that we play is to help the state and locals. They have the primary responsibility in protecting the critical infrastructure related to elections. So we'll continue to do that. On TPS Haiti, TPS decisions require us under law to look at, and maybe this is what you're referencing, the originating conditions that necessitated the designation of TPS. If those specific conditions no longer exist, the statute requires us to terminate TPS because it was meant to be a temporary program. So I'm not particularly familiar with the back and forth that you referenced, but I can just say broadly, unfortunately what that means is some countries remain perhaps unstable and have difficult conditions, but if they are not a result of the originating designation, that designation must be terminated. But I
would ask you if you could just look into that a little, because it
Yes.
seemed very clear that the report now they say many of the conditions. I don't know if one doesn't exist, that means that it's over, but that seems pretty arbitrary. So if you could just,
I will. I look into it. With respect to your question for documents regarding to El Salvador, of course, we'll be happy to provide any relevant ones. Neonatal care. So I do take this very seriously. As I mentioned in my last hearing, we do screen for pregnancy for women ages 18 to 56. We put them in a center if they must be detained that does provide the neonatal care. I will get you the names of the specific detention. We provide counseling. We provide access to outside experts if they seek additional medical guidance or prescriptions or other things they need that we can't provide. We give them that option. And then in terms of how I'm making sure they do that, I've had many conversations with the director. We have audits in place. We're taking this very seriously. And I just would ask, as I did then, if you have any concerns or specific examples of when that is not occurring, to please let me know, and we will take that very seriously.
I will do that. Thank you, and I would appreciate you following up as we discussed. And thank you very much for your service. And I would just like to note that I think I'm the only person that stayed under 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman.
Wow,
Thank you for that, Secretary.
Congratulations. Thank you so much for that. Chair recognizes a gentleman from New York, Mr. Donovan.
And I thank you, Ms. Rice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, I'd ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from the Jewish Federations of North America discussing the importance of the not-for-profit security grant program, a program that has made a big difference to the not-for-profits in my district.
Yeah, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, I hate to do this to you, but everybody's been asking you for questions answered in writing, and I have to actually go in the Speaker's chair in about 4 minutes to open up the legislative business, so I would just like to lay out my questions and ask you to do so as well. Earlier this week, my subcommittee held a field hearing in my district which focused on the importance of federal counterterrorism support to high-risk urban areas like New York City. Witnesses representing law enforcement and first responders in New York and New Jersey discussed the importance of intelligence information sharing and the Homeland Security grant programs to their operations. We must fully fund these grant programs, particularly in light of the evolving terrorist threat. Another topic of discussion at the hearing was the difficulty in securing mass transit systems. The Transit Security Grant Program is vital to those efforts, but the overall focus on surface transportation security programs dwarfs that of aviation security. Our witnesses expressed great concern about mass transit security, and that is a concern I share, especially in light of the attempted bombing at the New York City Port Authority terminal in December. Can you please speak or write to us to what more we can do to enhance the security of this transportation mode? How is DHS supporting information sharing when it comes to threats to mass transit? And my other question would be involving the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office. The President's budget request for that office proposes changes to the Securing the Cities program, a program that has proven very successful in New York City. We're hearing concerns from securing city jurisdictions about proposed changes in permissible equipment, to whom the equipment would be provided to, and the impact that would have on the jurisdiction's ability to conduct radiological detection and response operations. This committee has long supported the Securing the Cities program as it is currently operating, and the House passed my legislation authorizing the program just last year. My 3 questions involving that would be, what changes is the Department proposing to the program? What outreach have you done to participating jurisdictions to solicit their feedback? And how are you addressing the concerns that the Department is receiving from Securing the City's jurisdictions? I thank you for your service to our nation. I thank you for answering my question. I thank you for indulging me. I have to run.
Of course.
And I yield back, and Mr. Chairman, I used less time than Rice did.
Yeah, you yield back to, for the record, 2 minutes, 15 seconds. That's a record, I think. So thank you for that. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, who I noticed brought in 3 or 4 children to the hearing.
Yes.
And I want to welcome them as well.
Thank you. They're all our children. Those are survivors or our veterans that made the ultimate sacrifice fighting for our freedom around the world. So I thought it was important for them to follow us here and shadow us. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for pointing them out.
No, thank you for bringing them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing, and Commissioner Nelson, again, thank you for being here. Wanted to follow up on some of the comments made by my colleague, Mr. Katko from New York. I represent California, Orange County, California. Our nation's security is very important to my constituents, to our state. These are issues that are also very important to our taxpayers. Right now, as I travel through our district, which is Democrat and very Republican as well, I don't hear much talk about undocumented workers. As a matter of fact, in Central Valley, hear the need for more farm workers. Newport Beach area, I don't hear people talking about the nannies that are undocumented. I don't see that as a complaint. And then in Disneyland, our area that's heavy on tourism, I don't hear a lot of people complaining about the undocumented workers, waiters, waitresses, and cooks. But I'll tell you what I do hear complaints about in my district, and I think throughout the country, is this opioid crisis. Some numbers have it as high as 500% increase in usage throughout the nation. Deaths have skyrocketed because of the opioids. So my question really is, according to one of your DHS reports, the northern border threat, you have more and more phenanyls, ecstasy coming through Canada. What are we planning to do in the northern border? As Mr. Katko said, 96% of that border is essentially open. And so any thoughts about where we're going in terms of protecting our northern border?
Yes. So as I mentioned, I just was speaking with my colleague in Canada about this. So part of it is the partnership on both sides to make sure that we facilitate legal trade and travel, but that we reduce any illicit activity, including drugs. As you say, opioids continue to be a problem throughout the nation.
If I may,
please.
What kind of partnerships do we have right now with people north and south of the border?
They're strong. They're very strong with the Canadians. Yes, sir.
How about with the Mexicans?
The Mexicans, we have strong partnership as well.
Okay. General Kelly, who was in your position here a few months back, made some comments, and I agreed on, to the effect that if anything gets near our border, we've essentially lost a battle. If we're going to stop terrorists, we have to work with not only the Mexicans, not only the Canadians, but the Brazilians and some Afghanis and some of the others. Are you moving ahead and building those relationships through formalized information sharing agreements?
We are, absolutely, yes.
So following up on that, we're looking at building a border wall in the Mexican border I presume we're going to do something like that at the northern border as well?
Well, we're working with the Canadians, so we still need the.
Are we going to build a border in the northern border as well?
In some places, we need impedance and denial. Yes, sir.
So we're going to build a physical barrier as well, like the one we've seen on TV, the southern border.
We do not have a current plan right now to build an equivalent structure that we have on the southern border.
Let me ask you, and again, coming back to the opioid issue, before this committee, this Homeland Security was created, 30 years ago, we had a lot of our drugs coming into this country through Miami, through Florida. This country did a great job of stopping those trades of illicit drugs through the Caribbean. What we did is we shifted it inland through Mexico. As a result, we destabilized the whole country with our money that went to buy drugs, weapons, so on and so forth. So as we cut off the Mexico side, are they going to start flowing into Canada, and are they start going in through our seaports? And I say that to you because here a few months back, our Coast Guard commandant told us that a couple of years ago, they identified about 600 known drug vessels bringing drugs into this country, and they did not, the Coast Guard did not have the resources to stop, to intercede, to stop those shipments. So again, as a taxpayer, I'm running out of time. My question is the money best spent on a border wall, or is it, you know, cooperating with the nations, or is it, if you had $1, where would you spend it?
If I had $1, I think it needs to be all of the above. I mean, the short answer is.
But if you had a priority, ma'am?
If we have a priority, we have to secure our southern border, sir. That is where we see the greatest threat between the two borders.
Threat in terms of?
Drug smuggling, terrorists, traffickers, illicit activity, and violence.
Mr. Chair, I'm out of time, but I'd like to have a written information on that compared to what's coming through Canada and through the ports. Mr. Chair, I yield time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, I appreciate you appearing before myself and my colleagues today. Thank you for your service to our country. I'm concerned about authorization of Department of Homeland Security. As you know, this committee crafted in the House of Representatives in July of 2017 with overwhelming bipartisan support, 386 to 41 by vote, passed the full authorization of Department of Homeland Security. Yet we've seen no action in the Senate, and this greatly concerns me and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in the House. How has this lack of action in the Senate injured your ability to serve and protect our nation, Madam?
Well, first of all, I want to continue to thank this committee for your support. It is very important to have this reauthorization. So as you know, it would give us some additional authorities that we need. It would clarify parts of the law. It would clarify our mission sets, and it would give us the ability to more effectively manage to the mission by reorganizing within the department.
And centralized command and control, isn't that, by your definition and by those of us that sit on this committee, we would concur that centralized command and control is crucial to the efficiency of any operation. Would you not agree?
I would agree, because we do this based on risk. So it has to be a centralized look at risks so that we can match the mission set and resources accordingly.
So the effect of reauthorization, would you see that as allowing your department to operate and all the components, the agencies within your department to operate more efficiently and be better able to serve the nation and to protect the interest of national security?
Yes, sir. Not having reauthorization binds my hands, and those are the men and women of DHS.
Thank you, Madam. I hope my colleagues in the Senate are listening. It's been stated by some members here of this committee today several times regarding the caravan that you know who those people are. I find that difficult to believe, Madam. Is that true? How is that possible? Have they been vetted? Have they been interviewed by your agents?
No, sir.
Well, how would you possibly know who they are then?
I don't know.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. Regarding my colleague's request for confirmation of your 90% number for those that have been issued a citation, it's a summons for court, is that not?
Yes.
Yes, and a summons for court calls for probable cause stating that there's been some criminal act. And that criminal act would have been illegally entering our nation. Is that correct?
Yes, illegal entry without inspection.
So these illegal immigrants receive a summons for court, and then you're stating that 90% don't show up for court. I'd like to see the demographics of those numbers as well, because I'd be surprised if 10% show up for court. During the course of my career as a police officer for over a decade, I've had many interactions with illegal immigrants, either in field interviews or by stopping a car with no registration, expired inspection tag, etc. And there's nothing that can be done. You stop these guys, they have no driver's license. Driver's license is faked. Might be 3 or 4 of them in the car. You can't, it's pointless to give them a citation for a misdemeanor traffic violation, because they're certainly not returning for traffic court. You can't tow their car, because then they're on foot in your jurisdiction. You get phone calls all night. You can't bring them to jail because ICE won't come pick them up. So that's what happens to us folks. Nothing. Whereas an American citizen in the same situation will be cited, issued a summons, or perhaps brought to jail. So I'd be surprised if 10% of those that are issued a summons to American court and federal court for entering our nation illegally show up. So I would be interested as well to receive the demographics. Can you respond at all? Do you have those demographics? Who they are, their age, their gender, their nation of origin, whether or not they have an anchor family, et cetera? Can you provide that information?
We do have much of that, yes, sir. We're happy to provide it.
I would appreciate that. I'd certainly be interested in looking at it. Thank you, Madam, for your poise and your grace during your testimony. Your continued service to our country is greatly appreciated. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our ranking member. Before I get into my line of questions, Madam Secretary, and welcome, it's good to meet you. I just want to follow up on a question that my colleague just asked about. Your answer was you have no way to identify who is possibly in a caravan. I just wonder, why didn't you give that answer to the person who asked you that question?
Because he didn't ask. It was just part of his speech, and I just didn't want to interrupt him.
And you didn't feel a need to clear that, because that's a major, I think, part. You've cleared up some other things this morning. You didn't feel a need to kind of clear that up, just kind of for the record? No?
I was happy to do it just now.
Okay, all right. You know, budgets are certainly, I believe, a list of priorities. Many say that they kind of express our values, and of the things we've talked about this morning, we've certainly talked about building a wall and even detention beds and immigration enforcement. When you gave your list of your missions at the Department of DHS, it was listed first on your list. So I would just like to know, do you consider building a wall or immigration enforcement a higher priority than, say, restoring or increasing grant funding to local communities, local first responders who deal with violent acts and other threats every day?
So I think they're both important issues. I mean, I would hope the
Do you consider one a higher part? Because that's the business that you're in.
Right.
It's a tough job.
Okay,
Let
okay,
me finish.
all right, so let me,
it's a tough job.
Yeah.
And I just want to know, do you consider, based on your knowledge, training, and experience, keeping our country safe and secure is a tough but a big job, and I certainly believe you're capable of doing that. I want to hear from you, based on your knowledge, training, and experience. Do you believe that building a wall or immigration enforcement is a higher priority, because you have to decide how those dollars are spent, than increasing or restoring funding to first responders to deal with, oh my gosh, just a myriad of threats every day?
I think if we can keep the threat out of our country through strong border security, that is the first and best way to help those state and locals prepare. So we see 15 terrorists who are known or suspected who attempt to travel or travel here every day. Border security is homeland security. If I can do my job in keeping them out of this country, I'm thereby helping state and locals.
Can you tell me how many people have been killed because an act of violence at the southwest border during your tenure as secretary?
I cannot, but I'm happy to get back to you that figure.
Can you tell me how many, if any, Custom and Border Patrol officers or agents have been killed at the southwest border, or even, let me say this, severely injured at the southwest border during your tenure?
Sure, 2, and then the assaults are up 73%.
Okay, and so 2 officers, 2 CBP officers have been killed in the line of duty.
Last year, yes.
Last year. But you can't tell me overall how many persons overall have died at the southwest border through acts of violence, of course, been killed during your tenure.
I can't give you a specific number right now, no ma'am.
Okay, and you know, coming from Florida, where we just had a school shooting, 14 people died. In Orlando, a year and a half ago, we had 49 people who were killed in what we labeled domestic terrorism. And then folks who were just trying to go and enjoy a concert in Las Vegas died, lost their lives, 58. But you have no idea how many people overall died during your tenure at the southwest border. But you would consider that a greater priority than the 58, the 49, or the 14, those that are classified as domestic acts of terrorism. With your dollars, you believe that putting them at the southwest border is a greater priority. How do you justify it? Obviously you do, but please tell me how you justify it.
Sure, and I apologize, I'm not sure I'm following all of what I was saying is border security is a priority, and the reason for that is because if we can keep the threat from coming on our borders, whether that's drugs, whether that's terrorists, whether that's TCOs or gangs, then we eliminate part of the threat environment that the state and locals have to deal with. So that's why I was saying border security.
Can you tell me very quickly, because I'm from Florida, I think FEMA has been criticized quite a bit, as you know, about their response to Puerto Rico. And housing has been an issue. You know, there are multiple people in hotel rooms, hotel room, 8 people, 2 beds, but the program that would assist them has not been utilized to assist them, the Disaster Housing Assistance Program. Could you tell me if you have any plans to implement that program to help the victims from Puerto Rico?
Sure. So as you know, under the National Disaster Recovery Framework, it's actually HUD that has that recovery function for housing. So working very closely with Secretary Carson. Actually, Governor Scott from Florida has been very helpful in providing lessons learned from Florida and what we can apply to Puerto Rico.
So you are working with the Secretary to utilize that program?
Of HUD. We're working with him and what he can do within his programs. Yes, ma'am.
Do you feel like we're going to be able to reach an agreement?
I refer you to HUD, but I'm happy to commit to continue to work with HUD.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Gentlelady Yields. The gentleman from, where am I? Nebraska. The General Don Bacon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Nielsen, for your leadership. And we appreciate all the folks that work at Homeland Security and what you're trying to do for our country and keeping us safe. We're grateful. I want to just follow up on the statement you just made. You just said 15 suspected terrorists try to cross our border every day. Is that correct?
Who plan to travel, yes, sir.
Right. Could you just detail for us, at the unclassified level, obviously, how are the Sunni extremists, whether it be ISIS or Al-Qaeda, what have you seen and detected with them trying to cross our borders? So if you could just, because I think most people in our country don't realize this effort is going on every day.
Yes, sir, just much more broadly, because we're at an unclassified level, as you say. Let me just say that, we've also seen, I'm trying to think of what I can say. So we see these numbers in terrorists. We're happy to come and brief you on the breakdown. What I can also say is ISIS in social media has encouraged its followers to utilize our refugee program to come here. They, in writing, have encouraged people to come across our southwestern border. So we do see an uptick in any type of terrorist groups trying to come here, but happy to come brief you on the specific breakdowns.
What I think would be important would be at the unclassified level, carefully vetted by you and your team, to put this out to our citizens, because I think it's an important topic for our border wall and border security. When I think a lot of our folks, we think about the immigration issue when it comes to the wall, and that becomes caught up in political controversy. But when you know that there's actual terrorists trying to cross, and we have actual data, I think it would help shape this debate in a positive way. That would be my input. different topic. We know the Russians and Chinese are working to infiltrate our energy grid. And indeed, you know, the next December 7th won't be zeros with torpedoes coming in at Pearl Harbor. It's going to be preceded by rolling blackouts and the chaos that follows, and some of our bases don't have the alternate power. Could you talk about what is Homeland Security doing to help build that resiliency and protection for our energy grid? And how do we defend against this, and how can we help?
Yes, so I think you described the threat. I agree with your characterization. Unfortunately, it itself is persistent. They're becoming much more nimble and creative. So what we do is we work with a variety of partners. We put out alerts. We put out a technical alert, joint one actually with the United Kingdom just last week, about how we have seen nation states manipulating some of our systems to do some of the things you were just describing. We work very closely with state and local operators in the Department of Energy. We give them best practices. We share information. We've set up sector coordinating councils with the governance structures. We also work through fusion centers. But a lot of this is, if you'll bear with the expression, that basic hygiene. So we want to make sure that we're raising the level, everything from access control to passwords to basic malware detection. We have a system at DHS called the Automated Indicator Sharing Program. We're encouraging more and more companies and entities to do that. So at machine speed, we can advise them of incoming threat vectors.
Thank you. One last question. We're seeing criminal organizations and terrorists using more encrypted data in their communications devices. Very hard to penetrate at times and know what they're doing, and it impacts our law enforcement. What can we do to help you with this? And two, how do you partner with, say, DOJ or our local and state authorities, because they're the ones often caught having to deal with this?
Yeah, this is as we all know, this is a tough area of how to balance the conversation around encryption. We do work very closely with DOJ. At DHS, as you know, we have many law enforcement men and women, but particular mission sets that require their own use of encrypted data. So we have both sides of the debate, if you will. Part of this is increasing and going back to human intelligence so that we can really track those that we're trying to track, understand who they communicate with, who they are participating with. We certainly take that approach in TCOs, for example. So some of this is technological solutions, and we're working with the private sector on that. But some of it is going to good old, back to good old detective work.
Let us know, too, how we can facilitate or make this a easier problem for y'all to tackle.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you. And I'm under my 5.
Congratulations. Nice job. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Ms. Berrigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, did you testify that 90% of unaccompanied minors don't show up to court?
So I believe what has been referenced is my testimony in the last hearing.
What was the percentage you said a minute ago? Was it 90%?
I hadn't said that, but I think people were quoting me. From,
okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to correct the record because there's so much false information that comes out of this administration, and this is one of those. My records, which is the Department of Justice Immigration Court, as data states that 69% show up to court, and when unaccompanied minors have counsel, 95% show up to court. As somebody who's actually represented an unaccompanied minor in an immigration proceeding, I think maybe that sends a message that we should make sure unaccompanied minors have access to counsel. Your predecessor, Secretary Kelly, he committed to meeting with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus regularly. Will you commit to meeting with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus regularly like your predecessor?
Be happy to.
Great. Hopefully we can get that scheduled soon, because I know since you've been sworn in, we have not seen you come in yet. So thank you for that. Back in mid-January, my friend Senator Cory Booker had asked if you had met with any DACA recipients. At that time, you mentioned you had not. Have you met with any DACA recipients since that time?
I have not.
Great, thank you. My colleague earlier, Ms. Jackson Lee, had mentioned this recent court decision that came out this week about DACA applications. And I pulled the decision just to clarify for the record. The order says DHS must accept and process new as well as renewal DACA applications. This is in the court order. Now, that is the actual court order. The court order goes on to say that they're going to have a stay for 90 days so DHS can explain why they ended the program, because under the court, it was arbitrary and capricious. Madam Secretary, you are head of Homeland Security. Do you have a better explanation?
I'm sorry, for the court's decision?
Yeah, the court decision said
yes, so
that you had 90 days
right.
to better explain why the program ended, because what was given before was insufficient. I'm asking you, do you have a better explanation?
The explanation is very simple. It was an inappropriate use of executive power.
Do you have a better explanation? Because the court has already ruled that that explanation was insufficient. Do you have a better explanation?
Sitting here today, we're reviewing the court decision, as you know, that just came down, and we will be prepared to provide the court the requested information.
Okay, so you don't have one yet. Thank you very much.
I don't.
I'm looking forward to
as you know, the Justice Department does. So I defer to the Justice Department on arguing the cases on behalf of the United States government, as we do with all cases. But we
correct. But the Department of Homeland Security enforces them, and I think the court order is very specific that
we will comply. We'll provide them the information requested.
Great. Madam Secretary, you are responsible for more than 240,000 employees at Department of Homeland Security. Is that correct?
Around that, yes.
And many of those employees have security clearances. Is that correct?
Many of them do, yes.
Okay. Back in March the ranking member, Mr. Thompson, and I sent you a letter. This letter that I'm holding up here, asking you some questions about your handling of security clearance. You have not responded to that, so I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get some answers here today. Were you aware of the allegations of domestic abuse by Mr. Porter prior to his resignation in February of 2018?
Was I aware? In whatever was in the press is what I was aware of.
So you're saying, as a deputy chief, as a deputy working under Mr. Kelly in the White House, that you were not aware of allegations of domestic abuse by Mr. Porter?
I was the deputy chief of policy, and so I did not review nor access clearance request records or adjudications. That was not part of my job.
Okay, so the New York Times reporting is inaccurate about this, that you as a deputy chief of staff in November, when the FBI had a detailed report that was submitted to the White House, you're saying you did not see it and were not aware of it?
I did not see any FBI report. No, I did not.
Okay. So you didn't take any action at all regarding Mr. Porter's security clearance?
I would not have. It wasn't in my job description.
What is the policy at Homeland Security now on interim security clearances?
So we look at that very carefully. We restrict access when somebody has an interim. There's very particular circumstances in which someone might be granted, but mostly it takes a long time, as you know, to go through the adjudication process. And so we reserve bringing somebody on board fully in most cases until their clearance is fully adjudicated.
Great. Can you commit to responding to this letter of March 5th in writing, please?
Yes, I can.
Great. Thank you. I yield back.
Generally yields back. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary. I want to go quickly first into a particular and specific case with regard to USCIS and a constituent of mine whose initials are JB. I would like to hold up this documentation that outlines JB's efforts to adopt a young woman from Senegal. I think you might have had conversations with some of my peers as it relates to this process. I would describe it, in the interest of conserving my limited time, as tragic and ridiculous what this woman has been through, to include over a dozen trips to the nation of Senegal and an order from NBC, the National Benefits Council, under USCIS that suggests that they cannot complete the adoption of this young girl who has known no family but this particular woman in her life while she's in the country, thus regarding or creating a circumstance wherein this 6-year-old child needs to be sent back to Africa to an orphanage so that we can complete the paperwork. I don't take this tone with you to be derisive. But I would ask for your specific attention. I presume there are individuals who are here with you today who are staffing you. I want to make sure this paper gets in their hand and ask for your specific attention. This is a tragedy of bureaucracy that has a human toll and impact. Moving on, and so I'm going to set it there. Please.
You have my commitment to look into that, sir.
I genuinely appreciate it, and thank you for all you do. And I understand that there's 330 million Americans, and this is but one aspiring American, but this is the right thing to do. Moving on, there's been some interest expressed by some of my colleagues in prioritization as it relates to saving American lives. In fact, my good friend and colleague, Ms. Demings, pointed to tragedies in Las Vegas, Orlando, and at Parkland. Would it surprise you, Madam Secretary, if I were to inform you that the federal government fatality reporting system indicates that about 20% of all automobile accident fatalities involve unlicensed drivers, and about half of those are illegals?
I'm not familiar with that statistic, but no, that wouldn't surprise me.
Would it surprise you if the number of total people killed, American citizens on American highways each year by illegals, is estimated to be in the range of about 3,500?
No, it wouldn't surprise me.
Okay. Would it surprise you to learn that in federal incarceration we have 709,440 illegal people detained? Would that surprise you?
No.
Would it surprise you to learn that the best estimate of state and local incarceration figures for illegals in this country is in the neighborhood of 297,000, thus creating an incarceration of over 1 million people who are in this country illegally?
No.
Would it surprise you to learn that the cost to incarcerate those individuals in federal and state facilities exceeds almost $32 billion annually?
That's a large number.
If we had $32 billion annually to construct a southern border wall, could we keep those people out of this country, thus reducing the cost to incarcerate and also saving upwards of 3,500 lives every single year of Americans who die at the hands of people here illegally on U.S. highways?
We certainly could keep most of them out if we had a full border system, yes.
And so if we protected our southern border and kept these million incarcerated illegal criminal aliens out of our country, not only would we save lives, but we'd also presumably, if they weren't here, they couldn't be arrested and incarcerated, save about $32 billion a year in 2017 data, if the numbers that I'm giving you is correct?
Yes, yes.
Which would amount to over 0.3 trillion in a decade. I'm just like to do this because I'm a public school kid. $3,000 million that we could save if we built this wall on the front end? Okay. And so if we were able to make this one-time commitment to secure our southern border, would it in fact be a net cost saver paid for by, technically I suppose, the countries from which these individuals come by virtue of the denial of admission of illegal individuals?
It would save lives, it would save money, and it would protect our communities.
And ultimately, it would be paid for by the folks who currently are breaking our laws by virtue of their absence from our country, thus reducing the cost, would it not?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm just having fun here. I think, though, that these points are points that need to be made. As it relates to St. E and the Homeland Facility Consolidation Plan, I would comment that I am as frustrated as anyone. Having said that, sometimes I think it's time to start anew. I read the OIG report with jaw agape when I read, and I quote, that perhaps too much time, energy, and money was spent on revitalizing Washington, D.C. neighborhoods and the St. E renovations. Is it within the mission of Homeland Security to revitalize Washington, D.C. neighborhoods?
No, sir.
Is this what the American taxpayer expects their money will be spent on when they support Homeland Security expenditures in our budget?
I highly doubt it.
I do as well. And so I would point out by virtue of, and I would confess my self-interest on the front end, facilities like Vent Hill, which are very large former government facilities located within 53 miles of where we sit, where you could come and build right now and we wouldn't have the cost overruns of the litigation that drive costs up. Editorial comment. Finally, I know I'm running over, Mr. Chairman. We included in the authorizing budgetary language the ability to reinstate the waiver for returning workers under H-2B because we wanted you to be able to do it. So allow me to join my colleague, Mr. Keating, from the other side of the island saying, please help. It's not about foreign workers. It's about American businesses that have been around for decades that are shuttering because we can't create a system and circumstance wherein they have reliability and predictability.
I understand it should be a sustained program.
And I'm not, and again, not to attack you.
No, I agree. I asked for your help in passing it to
I'm
Congress
all over
so
it.
that it's a sustained program.
I agree. However, just because we haven't done our jobs yet doesn't mean, given that we've given you the latitude within your executive purview to do this, that we're not, I'm asking you humbly to do that. And I would point out finally that a returning worker by definition is someone who's already demonstrated a willingness to go home. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here and for your testimony here today. So in your testimony before the Appropriations Committee 2 weeks ago, you stated that the Department is diverting resources to help secure election infrastructure. Certainly, I applaud the focus on election infrastructure. Yet the budget request included a modest $7 million increase for the organization that carries out this analysis and support. And I certainly commend the Undersecretary designate Krebs for his prioritization of election assessments. But I worry that about the strain on NCAT's resources, especially since they are responsible for working with other areas of critical infrastructure, making them priority customers as well. So is the request sufficient to support important assessments in other areas of critical infrastructure sectors?
Thank you for the question, sir. So what we're doing is we're working, what we did receive in the omnibus was, I believe, 380 that went to EAC that we will, in conjunction with them, help state and locals prepare. We also have 26 million that went to NPPD, and we will continue to work with that. My comments on prioritization were simply that we all, and I know you share this, take this election very seriously. So in terms of processing vulnerability assessments, sending hunt teams, doing pen testing, providing clearances, we are prioritizing the election subsector. We will continue to work with our sector-specific agencies that also bring funding to the fight so that we can together have a holistic approach.
All right, so what data are you using to make sure that that NPPD has the resource it needs to respond to other areas of critical infrastructure so that it's not being ignored? Obviously, there's many attack vectors that they have to defend against, and how do we make sure that that those priority customers are not going to be ignored at the expense of the securing election equipment, which I certainly applaud the focus, particularly now on securing election infrastructure, but we also need to be focused on other areas of critical infrastructure.
Yes, sir, you have my commitment.
Okay, thank you. Secretary Nielsen, your budget request shifts more than $40 million in cyber research from the Science and Technology Directorate to NPPD. So I'm going to say up front that I'm very concerned about this proposal, and I'm skeptical about it. So what gives you confidence that NPPD, which has become primarily an operational organization, has the right tools and the people to take over this responsibility from S&T? Again, because this is an R&D function for the most part, which S&T would be the appropriate place to do this, are you worried that the high op tempo at NPPD will distract from the R&D work, or that the R&D work is going to take a back seat?
That's certainly not the intention, sir. Actually, it was to more closely align the needs of the critical infrastructure owners and operators in the 16 sectors to an R&D plan. So it was meant to make it more requirements-based. It's a priority to do so. As you know, the threat continues to evolve very, very quickly, and so we need to be continuing to do R&D as we operate, innovate as we go. And so that was the idea behind moving it to NPPD. But happy to work with you on how we make sure that that is used in the appropriate way.
I just want to be clear. I remain skeptical. This is something I'm going to stay very closely on top of to make sure that it doesn't become an afterthought or ignored. Secretary Nielsen, some of my colleagues have introduced legislation to start a bug bounty program at DHS. Some in your department have criticized the idea as being premature without robust vulnerability triage processes, and I certainly appreciate the concern. However, the newly revised NIST cybersecurity framework and other international standards point to having a vulnerability disclosure program, so with or without a bounty, as a best practice. And the Department of Defense and General Services Administration have both implemented successful policies. What in your mind would prevent DHS from having a vulnerability disclosure program that helps well-intended security researchers inform DHS about problems in its own systems?
So first of all, I agree that I think a bug bounty program is a very important tool. It's not a silver bullet, but nothing is. It's an important tool. We look forward to learning the lessons that DoD has learned in their own. We're watching the legislation that's going through Congress very closely, and we would prepare on our side to have the resources and planning that we need to then respond to what we find out through the bug bounty program.
But we're sort of talking about two related but different things. Yes, bug bounty program, but also a vulnerability disclosure vector, so that a program, so that when researchers find a vulnerability, they can report it to someone. Right now, there's nobody home. In other words, the security researchers don't have a way to contact DHS and make sure the DHS will then follow up on that program. So bug bounty program is good. I want to say do that, but why don't you have a vulnerability disclosure program?
Yep.
The Department of Defense does, the General Services Administration does, DHS does not.
We do have a way in which they can contact us and actually receive calls very frequently within the NCIC or directly to U.S. CERT. We are formalizing the program. But
U.S. CERT helps outside agencies. Okay, so if someone finds a vulnerability, for example, in a medical device, they would call U.S. CERT, and U.S. CERT can work to make sure that they put in touch with the right person at the company to make sure we handle that vulnerability. The problem is that's not the case. The U.S. CERT does not do that for vulnerability disclosures within DHS.
no, they pass it to the correct people. I'm just suggesting the different ways that you can get into DHS to report things like that. But we are formalizing the program. It's very important. I don't disagree at all. We need to be able to not only notify victims, which we do in conjunction with FBI, but we need to, in an appropriate way, balancing it through the interagency process, disclose vulnerabilities.
Could you work with us to make sure that we
Absolutely.
develop this type of a vulnerability disclosure program
Yes, sir.
at DHS? All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Last but not least, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ratcliffe, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here today. I very much appreciate your testimony that you've given on all aspects of how DHS is prioritizing resources to accomplish the President's agenda for safety and security of the American people. As the chairman of the Cybersecurity Subcommittee, I want to focus my few minutes with you on this particular area. And I will start out by saying, with all due respect to your predecessors who've had considerable talents and abilities, I'm of the opinion that you have brought with you to this office a greater knowledge and appreciation and are more steeped in cybersecurity than anyone before you. And I want to help you take advantage of that. I know we share the common goal of wanting to improve DHS's ability to impact the nation's cyber posture and defense. Because I know we also, I think, agree that cybersecurity poses one of our greatest national security threats right now.
Yes, sir.
So in the spirit of wanting to help you be successful, one of my priorities early in this term has been to investigate the continuous diagnostics and mitigation program. We've held 2 hearings, we've had a number of briefings, countless meetings, and I'm of the opinion that CDM is certainly a value add to our federal cybersecurity, a way to fortify our government networks and systems. So let me start out and ask if you share that opinion.
I do. I think it's a very part and parcel of one of our tools to find out what's on our network, who's on our network, and as you know, we're moving now 4th phase towards data.
So looking then towards the continued success, hopefully, of CDM, help me make the case to appropriators, to other members on this committee, as well as to the administration, about what we can do to ensure the value of the CDM program so that it's reflected in future budget cycles.
Yes, thank you. So we hope through the newest vehicle, as you know, it's called the Defend vehicle, we hope to be much more agile, and we hope to be able to utilize that to not only be up on the emerging threats, but to use it to understand the threat patterns so that we can more quickly come to you with requests for additional resources and tools.
One of the other priorities that the chairman and I have spent a considerable time on and will continue to do so is DHS's cyber workforce.
Yes.
In light of the growing cyber threat landscape, I think it's imperative that DHS be properly staffed with an essential cyber workforce to meet the cyber mission and to counter what are obviously some very highly sophisticated cyber adversaries. I know you haven't been the secretary for that long, but early on, are there programs or initiatives that you have identified as being most effective in recruiting and retention?
We have. So the NICE, the acronym NICE, program out of NIST and others, which helps us identify the unique the unique skill sets that we need to hire as part of it. But the other part is helping frankly, folks within the community understand the mission. When they understand the threat and they understand the mission, I find that they're much more interested in coming to serve their government. We can't pay them the same amount, but we can provide them an opportunity to serve their country and to serve a mission. We are looking at retention, as you know, benefits, different programs, cross-training, what we can do on the back end, and we're working on some pilots with industry to cross-train or do exchange so that we can both benefit from that experience.
And while I appreciate that, Madam Secretary, one of the things that we've already done, what Congress did in 2014, was to provide for some accepted service and expedited authorities to address this cyber shortage, if you will. And, you know, the indications are that it really hasn't been utilized or maximized to the extent that we would hope. Is that something that you're focused on?
It is, and I do agree that it has not yet been utilized to the extent that it should be. So yes, we are actively looking at that, and we thank you for that, including the cyber pay that went with that.
Well, again, let me just tell you that I think we have a great opportunity under your leadership and stewardship to improve the historical reputation of DHS, particularly as it relates to cyber issues. So I pledge to you that I want to help you in that regard to move the needle in a positive and appreciable way. So my door will be open to you in that regard.
Well, thank you. I'll take you up on that. Appreciate it.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I also want to thank you for your leadership in cybersecurity and yours, Madam Secretary. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary. Yeah. Thanks for being here today, and I think we all would agree that you have a very, very tough job, and I just want you to know that we do appreciate the work. We appreciate the difficulty and the long hours and the stress, so keep at it. You're doing all right. I want to talk about school safety, and I don't know if my colleagues have addressed this earlier, but certainly there's a local role to play. Certainly there's a statewide role to play, and the federal government also has a role. What do you view as the responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security in helping us get to the point where we can keep our kids safe and secure in their schools?
We actually hadn't discussed it, so thank you for raising the question. This is a very important topic and one on which we have spent a lot of focus. So we've created internal to DHS a task force, a working group. As you know, there are many parts of DHS that are part of this mission. So we do everything from active shooter training to awareness to helping states and locals build their alert and warning capability. We've also just released a soft target crowded places plan just a couple weeks ago, which goes through best practices on what to do and how to respond, but importantly, how to prepare. We also are part of the Commission on School Safety that's led by the Department of Education, working very closely with the National Governors Association and other associations. So we're sort of bringing everything we can bring to bear. Information sharing. We do have suspicious activity reporting, as you know, so we are updating that process. Working with state and locals training, so it kind of goes on and on. But yes, you have a full commitment from DHS.
Is there a lack of funding that we need to be aware of?
Much of this is what we already do, so it's just bringing it to bear and expanding the circles in which we have traditionally provided this information and this training, this exercises, et cetera. But if I find any, I will be happy to reach out to you and let you know.
Sure, I appreciate it. Secondly, and I know this has been discussed, but I wanted to raise it independently, is the aviation security piece. We talked about the transition from the AT to the CT screening devices. Ideally, I mean, we want these in all of our airports, right? I think there's 450 or so in the country, airports that we have. And I certainly hope that, and on this committee, that cost is never an issue here, because I can't, with all the tens of billions of dollars we spend on aviation security, I think this is money well spent. My question is there any concern about the deployment and the time it would take, given that there's only 5 or so suppliers of these types of machines? So even if we had the full financial commitment and the commitment of DHS to implement, are we looking at a lag time just based on the pure supply issue and the number of machines that we would need?
There is a supply issue. We're working very closely with industry to speed up the deployment, but that's why I mentioned before, our hope is that we do deploy the full amount that we've asked for in FY19 and that we come back with a reprogramming request to do more. So part of this is that partnership with industry and helping them in every way possible to go faster. It takes both of us together.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I think the ranking member would like to make some closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a record signed by, for the record, a letter signed by a number of members of this committee, both Democrat and Republican, talking about the H-2B visa program and the speedy implementation of it for this year. In fact, it's about you signatory on the letter to the Secretary. I hope we will get some response. I have a letter from a constituent who has had a business for quite a while utilizing this program and is threatened to be closed because of their inability to access workers for this program. So I'd like to submit these two for the record.
No, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
And while, I mean, we have, I'm glad you raised that issue. I've had a lot of members come up to me and ask me about the H-2B program. Would you mind addressing that, and what is the current status?
Sure. So we have finalized, as you know, the law requires us to work with the Department of Labor. We've done that. We've met with, and I've talked to a variety of members of Congress, ranking who share your concerns. They have very specific companies within their districts who are at threat to go out of business if they don't receive additional visas. So we are very aware. We have finalized our recommendation. It's working its way through the process, but we hope that we will be able to issue additional visas next month.
Okay, excellent. Let me also mention, I know UAS didn't come up today, but I know it's a very important issue to both of us and the United States security. These drones crossing across the border and domestically pose a grave threat. I can assure you that we are working on draft legislation right now and working with your staff, Madam Secretary, to accomplish that goal. And so I want to thank you for being here. I want to also thank you for your public service. You know, it's a tough job, and I think a lot of people look at Homeland Security and all they think of is border and immigration, and yet it's so many other things as well that you have on your plate, and I want to work with you to make your job successful. And so with that, the hearing record will be open for 10 days for if there are any additional questions, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
We have one, we're going to scan it. Scan it, we're good.
And then can I give you my...
Yes,